All right, so part 9 of our Truthmaker series. This is Abstract Particulars with me, Rodrigo, Kenny, Karen, and Josh. We're trying to make truth or something like that. For today, we read Gonzalo Rodriguez-Pereyra's Why Truthmakers? Now, the reason I pronounced it in the original is because I liked this paper very much. And I just want to say 2 things out right off the bat. One is it's Rodriguez, not Rodrigo, which means it's like dancing to David. So excuse me. And it's the nearest city to where I am is Pereira, but I'm not in Pereira. So this is not mine. Okay. But it may as well be, because this is what I've been thinking all along. In almost every respect, except where in those areas where he says he's just not going to go into it. And arguably, I think I could have been talked into that being a good tactic to make the cases that he's making, given all of the argumentation we've seen from others so far. So this is extremely exciting to me, and I'd like to consider this a demonstration that the Latinx philosophers are on the rise, although he's at Oxford, so whatever. Yeah, so seriously, this is also a nice little follow-up to the confusion that I had last week. I didn't speak as much last week because I got very confused about the Truthmaker essentialism issue. And as you may have noticed on Slack, I wrote an explanation of my follow-up thoughts, namely differentiating between Truthmaker essentialism and Truthmaker, what I call necessitarianism, for parallelism. But it's exactly the principle as he lays it out. Not that he's the first to do so. I think the others have done so as well. But the point is, where you put the necessity modal operator, whether it's scoped on the inside or scoped on the outside, makes all the difference. And I'm glad that he put it in the right place. And if we have time, it might be worth going into that distinction. I just wanted to say that up front because I was left flat-footed last week. As for the details of this particular paper, I very much appreciate that he speaks to some of the various alternatives that we've discussed, including Lewis's, Dodd's, Bigelow's, and a couple of others. A lot of weight is put on the grounding relation, and fortuitously, we, or at least some of us, just 2 of us really, not including me, just recently read Jessica Wilson's No Work for a Theory of Grounding. And so I hope we are especially well prepared to deal with this issue in relation to grounding.
Well, yeah, now I have to read that paper after reading this.
Yes, and we're going to discuss it again on Sunday because we didn't.
Oh, good. All right. I'll definitely be there.
Yeah.
And finally, I think this might be an especially strong challenge to Josh's ideas, not the identity stuff, but more broadly, your sympathy with Armstrong. So I hope to see sparks today. I'm very excited about this. Okay, so let's get everybody's reactions. Josh first, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the identity stuff is interesting with Julian Dodds. Definitely going to follow up with that. But yeah, I think the weight of this paper, or the emphasis is certainly on this grounding relation, or that truth-making is a relation, and the kind of relation is a grounding relation. And so it was quite quite amazing that we just read, at least Karen and I, Jessica Wilson's paper on grounding, where she argues that big G grounding in the way that it's being used here isn't really doing any work, or isn't doing enough work. And so I think that was like a wet blanket on my excitement of this paper, because there was a lot in here that I really liked. I think if we had read this sooner, I would have maybe had few, if any, complaints. But I was very convinced by Wilson that big G grounding is probably not saying as much as one thinks one is saying when one uses that in their theory. But apart from that, also Donald Davidson's Truth and Predication also made me question, I think it was premise 2, about the nature of grounding being a relation. Because it seems to me that he doesn't go into what he calls ways, but the ways of being are themselves, he suggests, are entities that will play the role of truth maker. But then, of course, if an entity has a way of being, and that itself is an entity, and then truth making is a relation between something like a proposition and that way, and relations are entities, there's going to be a regress problem here. And I guess it kind of depends on what ways are, and the relation between ways and propositions, and then what the nature of relations are. So leaving relations unanalyzed and just saying truth making is a kind of relation, it just makes me think of Davidson's critique about the third man argument, essentially, that if ways are themselves entities, you're going to have to link that relation to the truth making relation, and this is going to kind of spiral out of control. If it's a circle, I'm not sure. I guess it depends on how you deal with the relation and that entity. But there's everything as a relation path that he's gone down. I need to see him cap it off, and he doesn't do that in this paper. So it's interesting. But yeah, my own sympathies were towards an identity theory, but the person who kind of assumes my position is Julian Dodds, but it seems that he's trying to defend the grounding relationship, or at least that's how he's portrayed. He's trying to combine truth making as a grounding relation with truth as identity, and that clearly seems to lead to nonsense. I, in sort of adopting, or at least toying with truth, an identity theory of truth, assumed I had to give up truth making. So I am curious to see why Dodds thinks he doesn't. But it does seem to fail, at least as presented in this paper. But yeah, this is a really good paper. Unfortunately, it's depending on two concepts that I've recently been convinced are wrong. So if I just assume that they work, this is a great paper. Unfortunately, I don't currently, and he doesn't defend
Wait, the two concepts are
grounding
grounding and predication?
yeah, you could say that. It's grounding and the nature of relation or predication, or whatever the relation between a universal and a particular is. Leaving that unanalyzed, I mean, those are the battlegrounds here. At least that's what we've been shown through all these other sources. So he's kind of defending an area where I didn't see a big battle, and he's leaving the battleground sort of unacknowledged. So, so be it. But the paper as it stands, its target, it seems well argued for, and I don't have much else to say on that.
Ooh, I'll try to defend against those 2 points. So I'll take notes, make sure we get there.
Cool.
Karen?
Yeah, I was trying to think how Wilson's paper applied to this, and I mean, maybe intuitively he's helping himself to the notion of grounding as a sort of almost primitive notion, big G grounding, that might also show up in other kinds of relationships, like the grounding of the mental and the physical, or something like that. But he doesn't talk very much about grounding. So it could be that the grounding in this paper is one of those little G groundings where we just owed a story later, right? So, even Wilson is saying there's plenty of little G grounding relationships. It's just that they get spelled out as a type token identity, determinates, determinable relationships, those sorts of things.
Little
so
G
maybe
unspecified is big
little
G.
G unspecified. No, little G, because we do get something, right? We get its like entailment, but not, right? So you get, so it's some sort of necessitation across, and possible worlds are involved. So we get some. So I definitely would like to hear more about to what degree is he sort of taking this as an intuitive primitive notion, and to what degree can it be spelled out in such a way that it avoids Wilson's worries. And I am also interested in understanding, and I think this will come up in the postscript in terms of his response to Hornsby, about whether or not there are a method of understanding this concept of ways that doesn't assign them status as entities, right? And that would be, I think, trying to explore which he does talk about, and I'd like to work through it. What it means to say that the rose is red, And does that mean that the rose is being read as an entity in the world, independent of, well, I want to hesitate to say independent, but distinct in some way from the rose as being light, or the rose itself, right? So yeah, so I mean, part of it's going to depend on what we count as entities and what saying something is an entity implies about its ontological status, right? That can entities be made up of other objects and their properties, for example, and it still be an entity, even though it's nothing above and beyond the object with its properties. So yeah. So I have questions, but I like it. I'm very sympathetic. It seems very sort of straightforwardly the intuitive way to understand truth makers, right? Like, it's just propositions are not things in the world. They're not chunks of reality, but they're made true by chunks of the reality. And so there's a relationship there between the proposition and the reality, and it's asymmetrical. Maybe that should be, instead of photo, we should drink every time we say asymmetry. But anyway,
Or grounding. You could add grounding to
or grounding, yeah.
yeah.
Better not have a mimosa next Sunday. I mean, yeah, this grounding is going to come up. But yeah, so yeah, I do like the view, and and I like the way he sets it out.
I might have a local solution to this problem, because around here nobody uses Google Maps. They all use Waze. So whenever you say Waze, because it's not an English word, everybody thinks immediately of the app. So I know what Waze is.
That's true. That's true.
Kenny.
All right. I feel like this is the most cleanly written paper in this anthology. It was just like, it was just
Save
clean.
the best for last.
Yeah, no, yeah, and it was the last. Yeah. So I mean, he just I mean, it was nice reading. I was also delighted to see, that grounding came up, because this issue of the asymmetry, I feel like is part of, one of the big motivations for grounding. And it seemed like it had to come up, but so many of the articles were not quite talking about it. So I thought, I thought it was quite illuminating, but I haven't read the Wilson, so I'm curious what you guys think comes out of that in relation to this, because this was, I mean, it was pretty compelling. I suppose there is still potentially the concern about the third man issue, but I'm more ambivalent on that than Josh is. I'm not sure that there isn't a way of understanding relations which avoids that issue. So I mean, in a way it's come up in some of these papers that have even been in this book and that we read elsewhere, right? Because this issue of like the internal versus external relations, part of why it comes up, I think, in a way relates to this third man problem. But yeah, I mean, I mean, it felt like most of what he wrote was pretty unobjectionable. So I don't have too much to add other than that. Well, other than that, I want to read more about grounding after this, because it's so undefined, and you have and I have a strong intuitive feel for it, but I feel like it should be explicated more. So but yeah, the paper was great.
So clearly I'm going to be the skeptic this session. That's fine. That works for me.
No, I think Karen is too, right? Maybe not. I don't know.
No, I mean, I do have questions about the grounding relationship, but I think I would actually be kind of surprised if we had one relationship that would cover both things, like the relationship between true propositions in the world and the relationship between diamonds and their chemical arrange, like their patterns of, the structure of their carbon atoms and mental events and physical events and all the other ways where people like to use grounding as a replacement for some sort of reduction. Because I don't think that, so it's sort of like a connection that it doesn't necessarily imply a reduction or something like that. Maybe we should read Fine and see how he introduces it. But because I don't think that people would ever, a question of realism. Yeah. It's not that pleasant to read, but it's it's important. Because I would never be tempted to say propositions reduce to facts about the world or something like that, right? So sure, I'm not looking for grounding as a replacement for that move. Right? So maybe
could be a grounding pluralist, right? There are different types of grounding relations.
Right, which is what Wilson is perfectly happy with, right? She's perfectly happy with that. So, but then you do have to say, I think, a little bit more about the particular grounding relationship here. You can't sort of assert it as a primitive, which arguably some do, right? And that's what we're going to talk about next Sunday, is her primitive is fundamentality. So instead of grounding, which is kind of interesting.
This is tough. So we let you read about grounding, and now it's like Kenny and I can't contribute.
Well, you can next Sunday, right? And then you'll be back on track.
Hey, let's just. I just want to be.
You'll be grounded.
Let's just celebrate that I've read something that Kenny hasn't read.
No.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. That's funny.
That's a game I will never get drunk at.
And by the way, I know how you were able to do this, because Kenny's been talking about this paper for years and years and years. So he had plenty of opportunity.
It's true.
It's true. Right. Well, I mean, I wasn't able to read it because I was busy gallivanting around here. But is big G grounding? So my sketch of what Wilson says is that little g grounding is unobjectionable, but doesn't do the work that various other authors she's commenting on want done by the grounding relation. And then the question is big G grounding primitive, or is it, or will it receive some other explication? And then she may explore some options, but then leaves it up to the other authors to figure it out. So now, if that's the case, if that's a good gloss on what that's about, then why should we think that that Rodriguez's grounding here is big G versus little g? Isn't it open which of the two it might be?
Well, he does say things like it's connected to the in virtue of, which he says is a primitive notion, not reducible to something like entailment. But so it does sort of sound like he's kind of just offering grounding. It's a relationship, we all understand it, and so maybe that's sort of gesturing towards the the idea that grounding is sort of a it's I guess it's equivalent to the causal relationship was almost like a primitive, right? And so the grounding relationship is a connection between sort of parts and wholes and how they're kind of connected. That's sort of a a primitive notion of, or he is like, I mean, maybe it's we don't know which way the in virtue of goes, right? But so it's like a between, say, a car and its parts or something. The car stopped running in virtue of its part breaking or something like that. It's
I think
let me just say that I want this argument to work in terms of grounding, but I won't be satisfied if that means I have to take grounding as primitive.
Right. Yeah. So I guess it's primitive in a way that it's a kind of because, right? And so we we kind of treat causation almost as a, because we're not very good at reducing it to things like counterfactual dependence and all those stuff. So we sort of shrug and say, causation.
So Karen, I liked what you said. So if I kind of go off of what Wilson said, if you take big G grounding as something like supervenience with asymmetry, maybe a dash of necessity, I then want to know how it's different from constitutive determination. So any sort of relation between atoms and molecules. How is it that propositions being distinct from entities in the world have that same relation? So to me, it seems like because he doesn't say any more than that, this must be big G, which is, it's not specific enough to differentiate it from any other sort of big G relation. And it scares me that he's saying that truth making is, I think he says it's primitive, right? It's a primitive relation. So it sounds like it's big G
Well-
and it's primitive. That makes it seem like he's not going to make it a small G differentiation, because Wilson isn't against any kind of small G grounding if it's specific and it individuates and it rules out contradictory position. So that's her big argument against big G grounding, is that it actually allows for a lot of positions that you would not think are, for example, realist positions about entities. It actually allows for some idealist positions, which he even kind of hints at in this paper too. So I think he's almost kind of touching on some of the issues with big G grounding and yet relying on it. And so
What was
that
your
can't be right.
definition again? Supervenience.
So
Um,
supervenience is symmetrical, and that's one of the issues. So this is asymmetrical.
Asymmetrical
and it-
supervenience with a dash of necessity. I liked that.
Yeah, yeah.
But
with the
why isn't it
dashes.
just constitutive determination? Because honestly, if you asked me to define grounding and that occurred to me, I would just define it that way.
So the issue, I suppose, is the distinction of the entities. There's just no constitutive relation between propositions and whatever entities are the truth makers, right? The truth bearers and the truth makers are wholly distinct.
Well, unless you're an identity theorist.
Exactly, but which he rules out. So it must be a different relation. So if truth making is that relation and it's fundamental, or I'm sorry, if it's primitive, then there needs to be another one for constitution.
Unless you substitute the work done by entailment with real entailment, which can be given by constitutive determination.
Yeah, was that Rustall? Who was that?
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
Russell.
Yeah.
So anyway, those are my thoughts. This is just preliminary.
I mean, Wilson's gonna,
Yeah,
she says there's examples of quote unquote big G grounding that don't have asymmetry, right? They don't have
Right. That's right. She does say that.
they don't have this direction. And so she just points to all problems, which I mean, maybe there is a primitive notion of grounding, big G grounding, but it can't do all the work that we want it to do. Right.
Constitutive determination is already asymmetric, isn't it?
Not
Who did we just read? Bernstein, who argued not so.
Not so,
A is a
right?
constituent of B. B is not a constitutive of A. Right?
Wait, Bernstein? Wait,
But what the direction of the determination is not
Yeah.
a set.
Right.
Okay.
So, I mean, what Bernstein was sort of arguing that the direction is not set for the universe, right? So it could be that some wholes determine their parts and some parts determine their wholes. And so the fundamental level somewhere in the middle. But Wilson talks about things that could be self-grounding.
Okay, but
and also levels of mutually grounding interdependent things. So that's how she
are you identifying being a constituent of with being a part of?
Constituent, yes. I guess what's the difference?
Well, what I had in mind is constituent being something more like being a determinant of. And I had part whole being more about fusions and,
Okay, yeah, I think then we should just use the word determinant.
Okay, fair enough. These are, I mean, I'm just happy to know where the issues are. I can't really,
yeah,
especially.
But I mean, we should.
fundamentalism. I don't really know what to think. But
I mean, maybe we should just go through and see
Yeah,
where worries come up about how this author uses grounding, like where
Yeah.
it seems it's
And also,
not enough is being
even-
said,
even if
or
we
he's open
don't-
to criticism.
And also, even if we don't, we can't here solve all the Wilson problems because only half of us read the paper, and half of us didn't read the whole paper, right? So Josh got halfway through.
But it was a good half.
I still have 5 pages
Not
to
sure it was
go.
the better
I still have
half,
5
though.
pages to go.
Okay, so no one finished it.
No one finished it.
Well, I read enough to know this. Her target
That means
is not-
I just have to finish it tonight, and also
You'll be ahead of all of us.
Oh, the races! The clock is ticking.
So Wilson's target is not the type of relation that we would call grounding, but rather the notion of big G grounding, because it's just been used in so many different ways. It's not doing the work. But she's for small g grounding, whatever that would be. She just thinks once you've offered the required specifications that will set it apart from its competing positions, then you've done the work necessary that big G grounding just hasn't done. So it isn't that grounding relationships, qua grounding relationships are off the table. She's just arguing against the notion of big G grounding where nothing else is specified. So sort of underspecified determinant relation it's not going to do the work you want it to do. And it just
Right.
seems that that's what's being employed in this paper. So
Right.
he just needs
Yeah.
to say more to set it apart. That's it.
And I think this is important because the grounding relation in question here is, of course, how truth might be grounded in reality, which will come down to how propositions or the truth value of propositions would be grounded in portions of reality, the relevant portions. And we might have intuitions about that particular grounding relation without settling the larger questions about grounding in general.
Yeah.
And that might be enough for us to get a grip
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
the author wants, right? Because maybe he's not wanting to be specific about that specific grounding relation in order to bring in as many readers as possible, or maybe because he doesn't know what to think yet, and he just doesn't want to have to rule out addressing people who have their own grounding idea and are committed to grounding for this particular relation. Okay,
But
so
also
let's-
setting aside grounding, I really want to kind of critique the entailment necessity stuff too, especially when we
Yeah.
get to the existence of P entails other propositions, because it seems to me you're going to get the sort of transitivity of entailment that I'm not sure will survive the critiques of other authors that we've read. But I only read it once, so I kind of wanted to kind of think about it more. But that was also a separate concern apart from grounding.
Okay. All right, cool. So let's dive in. So the first thing, I don't have anything on the introduction other than that he's committing himself to the slogan. I like his slogan-oriented argumentation. I think that's very powerful. It sounds superficial, but it's just the opposite. We very often in philosophy attach ourselves not to the formalization of some idea, of some doctrine, but to the slogan. For instance, meaning is use in Wittgensteinian philosophy of language. But then you ask specific philosophers what they mean by meaning is use, and you get different answers.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting, and it enriches the conversation to go into exactly what they mean. I think it's also powerful to remember that what brought them together was the slogan, and the slogan signals or symbol references. The slogan is where the intuition is.
Yes.
Somehow.
Yeah, right. It's the source.
Yeah, that's what I meant. The slogan is the source of the intuition, right?
This is something I loved
Yeah.
about the paper. Instead of giving some formalization and then spending like a page trying to explain how to intuitively grasp what was said, he just says, here are the slogans. And to kind of set this apart from like rhetoric, now I'll give you the specifics. But this kind of like triggers the intuitions, gives you a sense of what I'm talking about, and now let me like, shore it up. I
Yeah.
love that as a format. Like that's how people communicate. That's beautiful.
It gave it a
And-
certain
and-
clarity, which was just like
Yeah.
really refreshing.
And ironically, it's a clarity through ambiguity, right? Because
Yeah.
the point is, the reason you buy into it is the slogan. And if you don't like his particular way of formalizing it, what you're drawn to do is not to reject the argument, but to formalize it your own way because you liked the slogans. Okay, so
Right.
the first slogan he accepts is no truth making without truth makers. Okay. I mean, that's what everybody here is for, right? I mean, all truth maker
Right.
theorists accept that. That leaves out what truth making is, what truth makers are, but it says something. All right, so that's what the introduction tells us, as well as, of course, that he's addressing himself to Lewis and Dodd. We have read Lewis, but maybe we will read more. And Dodd we haven't, but we will, I think, unless Josh skims it and doesn't find it that interesting. Okay, and then section 2, he lays out his way of doing the truth-maker principle, which, as I said earlier, I contrast with the truth-maker essentialism laid out by, who did we read? Parsons. So here it is. Necessarily, if bracket P bracket is true, then there is some entity in virtue of which it is true. And by the way, now we know what brackets are. I don't know if you noticed the footnote, but it's supposed to indicate not the sentence, but the proposition. So
We've read like 7 papers and they all have a footnote that say the same thing.
really? I just keep forgetting. Okay,
Yes.
well, I won't forget this
Yes.
time. I won't forget this time. Okay, so then we have the in virtue of in there, which of course is going to be the grounding relation we've been talking about. And we also have the entity, right, that exists, and we have a review of the relationship between the entity and the proposition being rather the relationship of entailment, potentially, between not the entity, but the proposition E, the entity exists, and the proposition. But then immediately he jumps into the negative existentials. Here he cites Bigelow. Maybe we can skip reading Bigelow. Maybe all Bigelow did was tighten the problem and force people to deal with these issues. Otherwise, I might have accepted an excerpt of that book sprinkled into the anthologies. But at any rate, we have ST and ST star, where ST is counterfactual talk about what truth makers would exist, you know, in the case of a false proposition having been true. And in the ST star, you have the same thing, but put in the lingo of possible worlds. And I had come up with these ideas myself after reading the first paper, but then quickly let it go when I realized that it seemed to compel a motor-realistic reading. Not because that bothered me, but because I wanted to leave it for last, since I know that that's not a view readily accepted. But here it's right up front, which I found very interesting. What did you think of that?
Well, we're not told what he thinks the worlds are. So
yeah, no, of course. By modal realist, I was wrong. I shouldn't have said that. There's two different meanings to
it sort of
modal
means
realist. There's the Lewisian one, which means concrete worlds. A better name for it would be concretism about possible worlds. And then there's just worlds of any kind. The other obvious one being abstractions of some kind, whether it's Armstrong's or Stalnaker's or Plantinga's.
Plantinga, yeah.
Right. So, but even so, right, if your truth maker theory depends on truth maker entities that exist at those worlds, then that is a way of dealing with negative truths, negations, that is. And it doesn't seem to be Armstrong's way of doing it, or at least the way that was, I think, most readily entertained by Karen and Josh in some of the previous recordings. I remember Karen saying that if there's no cat in the house, then the truth maker for that proposition is the house and all of the contents not being catty, right? So that's not really involving other possible worlds. It's just the actual world's house, which seems not to be in the spirit of ST and ST star.
Yeah, but our author rejects ST and ST star. Well, he doesn't reject them. He says he's not going to challenge them, but they're just not truth making.
Well, they follow from TM, but
but they aren't TM.
Yeah.
Well, but he's just being really careful. It's his game. His game is not TM, therefore ST and ST star. His game is there's an entailment relationship here. So if you give up on one, you have to give up on the other. But do we really give up on the other? If you give up on the other, all these other things. So I think he is going to accept it all, but that's just, of course, my biased reading.
But hold on, the difference between ST and ST star is that there's a modal analysis of necessary, right? Because necessary disappears and you have possible worlds, right? But for
No, they're
no,
both modal. It's just that the first one is modal
no,
using subjunctive and the other one is using possible world language.
no, that's what I mean. They're both modal, but in the second one, the modal necessarily is analyzed in terms of possible worlds, right?
Yeah, that's the
For
difference.
Yeah.
Armstrong, he would have a different analysis of necessary, close to what Karen was saying, where it isn't just the house as truth maker, but the states of affairs of the house lacking the cat on the mat, making true the negative, the negative existential proposition, right? So there still is a modal analysis on Armstrong's account. It's just different from ST star, right? So ST doesn't contradict Armstrong necessarily.
Wait, is that right for negative? I mean, you're talking about specifically negative existentials, but
Yes.
it's not clear that ST star, maybe it would be true for planar propositions for Armstrong as well.
Oh, it might be. I'm just defending ST. I'm not sure about ST star.
Actually, can we just take a look at this?
Right,
in
no, but
detail?
what I'm saying is,
I'm not sure I understood this. Like,
I'm just
let's
saying
say
that-
the cat is,
yeah.
there is
So
no
for
cat in the
Armstrong,
house.
the truth maker is the states of affair, which includes the entities and the relations between the entities, right?
Right, but
So,
But what
yeah,
about
of
negative
course.
existential?
so the states of affairs, including the same entities of the house, lacking the cat being on the mat, being part of the states of affair. So the lack of that relation within the states of affair as truth maker for the negative existential is still the truth maker for the negative existential on Armstrong's account, right?
But my understanding is that for Armstrong, worlds are assemblages of states of affairs,
Yes.
right? So I think, he can read this ST star principle as, you just interpret possible world W in terms of his combinatorialism.
Okay.
So-
Yeah.
I mean, interestingly, it's Lewis that supposedly abandons ST star, according to this paper.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Um,
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah,
But,
I didn't
I mean,
understand
I think
that.
the point is that, I mean, it just, so Rodriguez-Pereyra says this just links, was it, how to say, truth makers, truth supervene upon being. And once you do that, then you're going to have these counterfactuals involving worlds being true, but that's not going to capture the truth-making relationship, because truth doesn't merely supervene on being. Being dictates truth. Like, there's a direction there that's not captured by either ST or ST star.
Yeah. That's right.
Right. So it's the ST and ST star are both too weak,
Exactly.
right? Because they don't capture the direction, what Wilson will call the direction of priority. Right.
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 And so
Yeah,
they might follow,
But
and
they do
interesting,
follow,
people want to
which is
challenge them and abandon them. So maybe
Right.
he eventually would have to defend them if they're entailed by what he does want to defend, right? But yeah, I mean, he sort of briefly does at the very end of section 2. He says, although truth making is more than supervenience of truth upon being, the supervenience principles follow from TM. If there can't be a truth without a truth maker, then there can't be two worlds with the same entities, but in which different propositions are true. Thus, ST star follows from TM.
Right.
Similarly, if there can't be a truth without a truth maker, if a proposition is true, there must be an entity that would not have existed if the proposition in question had been false. Thus, ST follows from TM, right? So these things follow, but they aren't
Yeah.
strong enough to capture the relationship, because they don't explain the asymmetry that we need to explain.
Also, metaphilosophical point. Sorry. This I thought was beautiful, because he's saying, like, yeah, this is why people have argued against it. I'm also not going to accept it. But here's why. It doesn't even capture the intuition of this in virtue of relation that we have. But it does follow from that intuition. So I'm going to defend it, because if it doesn't hold, then my theory won't either. I mean, it's just multiple layers of like honorable philosophy.
Yeah.
Well
Absolutely.
done. Like, applause.
Yeah,
Right.
no,
Just going like,
I
yeah, they're
noticed that
right.
as
This is,
well.
yeah, it's just so well done.
By the way, before we
The
go
one does
forward-
wonder why Lewis wants to abandon it, and if there's an argument that needs to be responded to there. But
Yeah.
yeah, but
I need some help understanding why Lewis, what it is that he's rejecting and why. I didn't look too closely
Yeah.
into it. But ST,
We're given we're given no clue.
It's
right?
yeah, he
It's
just cites the
in
2001
passing,
paper.
And it says in
Yeah.
2001, Lewis challenges
well,
Yeah.
that is the paper I want us to read later. So
ST.
we can
Okay.
postpone
Well,
thinking
well,
about
that's
it.
good.
Yeah.
Well, it's not unrelated to
No,
Dodd's
actually,
argument, right? Where if you
maybe
I-
Lewis is, yeah, maybe, I mean, maybe Lewis wants to keep ST star. I don't know. He's challenging
yeah.
ST, right? Who knows?
Can I just say about ST? So if for the negative existential, remember he's saying if P were P false, well, let's just take an existential and then ask if P were false, at least, let me read this out loud. If P is true, then either at least one entity exists, which would not exist were P false, or at least one entity does not exist, which would exist were P false. So that's a little convoluted for me, but I take this to mean that in the case of the negative existential, if it's false, then that means that the entity that would make it true, were it false, then would exist. So if we say there is no cat, what that means is that there is that were it true, there would be a cat to make it true, and that entity does not exist, and that's why, well, maybe not that's why, but rather that is something that can be said of the absent truth maker for that proposition. So it doesn't actually tell you what the truth maker is for the negative existential. It just says something about what would make it true if it were false.
Yeah, it just links the truth of the proposition to the entities which exist in the world. And that's why it's cashing out, and that's why it's cashing out the truth supervenes on being slogan.
right, you got
That's
two
what
possible, all the same entities, all the same properties, and yet the truth value of the same proposition will differ, and that's just not going to work for, well, anyone. It shouldn't work for.
Right.
But for Lewis specifically, and then of course Dodds, that's his argument, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, there's a sort of subtlety here about quantification that's going on.
Right.
You know, which we'll get to in section 3 here.
But ST though, however, just one more thing. ST is saying less than another axiom that was insisted upon by at least one other author, maybe more than one, and that is that every truth has a truth maker, right? It's not telling us what the truth maker would be in certain cases. It's saying something about the truth makers that would be if the proposition were false, not if it were true.
Is that a problem?
It's not a problem. It's just that if you happen to believe that every truth has a truth maker, then it is not entailed by ST.
Right, but I think even for truth maker maximalism, isn't it that
Wait,
for the
No, it is by ST, right? If P is true,
yeah, but if it's,
then there's a entity
oh, you're right. I
which
just
makes
read
it
this
true,
wrong.
presumably.
Never mind. You're right. Yeah, yes. I don't know what I was thinking. I mean, I know what I'm thinking. I just don't know why I inserted it into ST.
I mean, it doesn't specify. It doesn't specify it's the truth maker. It might just be like randomly connected, right? Like, oh no, I just found out that I'm this entity that must exist if the rose is red is to be true.
Right. I think the idea.
Yeah.
I think the idea is to try to say that if something were to make a difference for the truth of a proposition, then that seems to be a good candidate for something related to truth making, right? So this is a pretty natural modal formulation of the truth making principle. His only objection is that it doesn't give you the asymmetry. It isn't that it's false. He affirms it as well, because of course it follows from TM.
It does make me wonder though, if you plug in there is oxygen on Earth for P and ST, necessarily if there is oxygen on Earth is true, then either at least one entity exists which would not exist if P were false. That'll be me. Right? if there's no oxygen on Earth, bye bye me. So yeah, maybe it.
Josh, what did you think of the
Maybe
point?
maybe it could be stumped by other kinds of necessary connections, but maybe I don't necessarily have to breathe oxygen.
Well, it's not that it's stumped, but I think what you're pointing out is that it isn't as fine-grained as he wants. It isn't as
Exactly.
discriminating, right?
Right.
Because there will be other things which are necessarily connected to the more relevant thing which is changed in the world, right? Like, I mean, at least relative to laws of nature.
Mhm.
Josh, what did you
Right.
make of the idea that Dodd thinks ST lacks motivation?
Right.
That was
Okay.
interesting. Yeah.
This is at the top of 229.
Yeah, just from my memory, he then tries to give an intuitive account of just the truth-making relation. Not specifically ST though, right? What was his response specific to ST though?
But Dodd has a supposed counterexample to ST.
Yeah,
Um,
but his first argument is that it lacks motivation.
Well, does it mean that you now have to populate your ontology with non-existent entities?
That's probably
And
that
maybe
sounds
that's
right.
not as so there are lots of things that are false. Like what was the one from, was it last week? There are no bearded worms. So now we have to say there's an entity, a bearded worm, that exists, right? So that the second part of this is true. If P is false, there are bearded worms, then at least one entity does not exist. The bearded worm doesn't exist. I don't know. So what does it mean to say that that's an entity? Maybe that's, I assume we need to just read Dodd to find out.
Yeah. This is the
Lack of
intuition
motivation
that I
is
was
then.
trying to insert into ST, but it's not there. Where it is in Dodd's complaints.
hmm.
Right, and I think what is argued for here is that because ST follows from TM, that ought to be your motivation, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's basically saying you just have to deal with it, unless you really want to get rid of TM. But that's not as controversial.
Right, so right after on 229, he says, as I said, Dodd argues that ST lacks sound motivation, and then the one sentence he says, I have to meet Dodd's challenge, for if ST is wrong, then so is TM, which entails it. And TM, as he outlines on the first page, is this incredibly intuitive account of truth making, of this relation between propositions in the world. So if Dodd's complaint is it lacks sound motivation, you can't get a better argument than that. If ST entails TM, and if somebody wants TM, well, then you're motivated, right? Yeah, but then
The
the argument
opposite
for
of
Dodd
TM
still has
entails ST.
ST
Yeah, we should
entails.
look at Dodd's counter
ST.
example. Yeah,
All
that's
right,
a
so
good
section
idea.
3.
Good point.
So the way I understand the structure of this is something like, if often a source of motivation can be an example which you intuitively think exemplifies the truth in question, and which seems fairly arbitrary. And so what Dodd means to do to undermine the motivation is to provide a simple counterexample which seems fairly arbitrary, which defies the principle in question, the ST. So he gives an example of this red rose, right? He says, imagine a world W1 in which a certain rose is red. In that world, the proposition that the rose is red is true. Now imagine another possible world, W2, which has exactly the same entities, right, in W as exist in W1, but in which the rose in question is white. So in this other world, W2, the proposition that the rose is red is false. Seems pretty clear. These worlds, if they are possible, are a counterexample, right? Because they have all of the, they have exactly the same entities, other than propositions. he says. But the proposition that the rose is red is true in one, but false in the other.
Yeah, I liked this. Even if you admit of properties, right?
There's a, right. Yeah.
Like if you admit the property of whiteness and of redness, and even the instantiation relation, you'll have two worlds. They both have the rose. They both have the property white. They both have the property red, and they both have the instantiation relation. They're just differently arranged, but they have the same entities.
Right. Yeah, they
Right.
exactly. Yeah, right. So having the same entities is not enough.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it.
And in a way, maybe this makes sense, right? Because like because truth making requires a more fine-grained discrimination, right? I mean, it is the very fact that the properties and objects are hooked up in the way that they are, that we're sort of hoping to capture. But here, in a way, this is sort of exposing that the principle is just sort of counting them all up by type. And as long as they're all there, then then you've observed the ST, and yet you get this counterexample. When I read this, I immediately thought of the Leibnizian essentialism that came up the other day. Was that what it was called? Leibnizian essentialism, right? Because remember, there are those who buy the Leibnizian essentialism will think that you can't just transpose this object into another world because its properties have to come with it, essentially, right? So anyone who is thinking along those lines will just deny this counterexample as being possible. As being possible at all.
Right. I think that was Parsons against Armstrong's necessitarianism, which he argues entails
No, essentialism, not necessarily.
No, he's saying that Armstrong's necessitarianism entailed essentialism, which brings in this Leibnizian
Right.
essentialism.
Oh, I
That
see
was
what
the
you're
problem.
saying. No,
And remember, I was saying I don't know what the history here, but why does necessity bring in essentialism? Like I just wasn't familiar with the
No,
background.
I think I know.
It was because of it. It was because of. I mean, it doesn't on its own, right? It was because what Parsons was doing was exposing that Armstrong also holds that all properties are, all qualitative properties are intrinsic or essential or something like that, right?
Yes, but specifically necessitarianism is not what I described in my write-up, where you understand the truth maker principle in terms of didicto necessity as opposed to de re essentialism or essence. Instead, necessitarianism is what Timothy Williamson talks about elsewhere, and something we haven't read, which is that every object that exists necessarily. Right. So what that means is that, like, if a rose has its color essentially, if a rose has its color contingently, then it can't be intrinsic to the object, because if objects exist necessarily as they are, I guess that's the step I'm missing. Anyway, it's a modal argument that results in this association of necessity and intrinsicality that we ought to call necessitarianism, as opposed to what I called, or what I wanted to commit to with respect to the modality of the truth maker principle, which is nothing other than that the biconditional relating the proposition to the truth maker be a necessary biconditional. That says nothing about intrinsicality or essence. But I do have to face up to this objection here, that you can have two worlds that have all the same entities, including universals, and yet they are distinct worlds, which means that worlds can be distinguished by something more than or something other than their ontological account. What would you call this? Their ontological. The two worlds can be ontologically equivalent and yet not identical, or not otherwise equivalent. And so what it comes down to is, well, how things are, the ways.
Right. Yeah.
Right,
No.
but-
This is. It's
but
really
then
the subtlety that he pulls out of this is so beautiful. Right.
Right, but
Because
then-
at the end of this section, he just says the counter example is consistent with a weaker supervenience of truth upon being, the supervenience of truth upon how things are. For there's no possible world, WN, in which the things are as they are in W1, but which differs from W1 as to what is true in it. He says, in effect, although Dodd rejects that truth supervenes upon whether things are, he accepts that truth supervenes upon how things are. And he says that a similar conclusion is reached by Lewis.
Right. This is why
Right.
actually I can probably intuitively reconstruct why Lewis makes a fuss of this just based on his human supervenience, which is probably where it's coming from. But I very much like how our earlier comments, metaphilosophical comments or observations about slogan-oriented, I was going to say slogan-oriented programming, which may as well be a good thing too, but
Love it.
Slogan-oriented philosophizing. That truth supervenes on being is ambiguous with respect to being, right? As I read truth supervene,
Right.
as I read the supervenience of truth on being, I would not admit how things are as satisfying that supervenience slogan. I would want it to be limited to whether things are. But of course, because it is a slogan, you read it however you want. You know, I mean, if you're satisfied, if your supervenience intuition about truth and being is satisfied by the distinction of worlds on account of how things are, then you'll be led down a different path. Now, with respect to Lewis,
What?
yeah.
Wait.
Well, that's why I said
Wait.
Essentially what this section raises, although he doesn't cash it out in this manner, is that there are subtleties going on with the quantification. Like, what are the
that's what I was gonna get at.
quantifiers? What are the quantifiers ranging over? Do they range over the ways or not? Because ways are often sort of often thought of as sort of like second order entities in some sense, and so you might not immediately read it off that way. Of course, here then the metaphysics start to really matter, right? Because if you are a trope theorist, the entities are particulars. They're abstract particulars, but they're particulars, and so you would naturally read it as quantifying over. Yeah, right. And so you'd naturally read ST or any similar principle as quantifying over the tropes, and so it would actually make a difference because in W2 there's a different
no particular redness of the rose.
Yeah, there's no particular redness of that same rose.
In other words, the entities are distinct.
Yeah, right. In other words, the entities are distinct.
Which is what our author is ultimately going to argue, right? He's going to argue that there are no differences in how things are that aren't also differences in what there is.
He's very careful to put it in exactly the way you put it, so that he doesn't have to commit to anything else that goes by the way of tropes and abstract particulars.
Right.
But,
yeah, it's true.
But I myself
what it is
don't see any
open.
other way to do it.
Well, it's gonna be something that can stand in that, be distinguished from other ways things a particular thing is are, and it's gonna it's so.
Oh right, that's his. Okay.
So his thing is
that's him, huh?
That's right. He's the resemblance anomalence guys. I was.
Did you listen to that?
I did. I listened to it today. Yeah.
Oh, where is this?
I should have listened to it. It's in our Slack, I think.
As beautiful as
Karen posted it.
Yeah, Karen posted it.
But without the handout.
Oh,
Anyway.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't find it that bad.
see.
I didn't find it that bad, but
What is resemblance
Well, he-
nominalism? Can you give me the 30-second?
it's something that I can't agree with. So it's going to be hard to portray it accurately, but that particulars resemble each other, and that's it. And to the extent that they resemble, he brings in sets. So he's not a nominalist that rejects all abstract entities. He accepts sets. So to resemble something other particular is to resemble the set of things that look that way. So it resembles the set of blue things. It resembles the set of dog-like things. And so all you need to grant are sets, and then you get resemblance. And so the ways of being are the aspects of a thing that resemble the sets of things of other particulars. So you're always referring to particulars, and you're mapping this resemblance relationship in terms of sets.
I see. Okay.
I think that's
I just
fair.
thought-
I don't know. Maybe Karen could give a better.
Well, there
I
was
just
some
thought that,
distinction there that I, with like grouping versus, yeah, that seemed to be a stronger notion than just being in a set. Like, but yeah,
what
I'll
I'm
have
saying.
to try and figure out
He's a
what the
weak
sentences
nominalist
were.
in the sense that he grants some abstract entities, specifically sets, and then to resemble is to just have the particulars have this relation of being members of the same set. And that was basically all he
Right.
needed to get his argument off the ground. But, oof.
It just occurred to me that asking for a 30-second is kind of like a 30-second elevator pitch, except in the case of philosophy, it's the 30 seconds of philosophy required to get somebody to leave the elevator so that you can rest of it.
But this
without
one's
any company.
this one's particularly hard because it's a recording of a talk that he gave where he just refers to a handout and he talks about sentences by number and never reads those sentences aloud. So,
Oh no.
so he talks about the difference between number 4 and number 5, but we never hear what number 4 or number 5 is. So
Is the
yeah, so
handout
that's
on
why
the
I
Aristotelian Society
the
page?
Yes.
handout does not seem to be. Well, I couldn't find the handout. I found a paper.
No,
and
the
I didn't know
paper
the
and the
numbers matched up.
sentence versions that he's
Sentence
referring to are in the paper.
Are
So
in the
maybe-
paper as
or maybe
numbered in
he's-
the paper. Okay.
Maybe he's just
So
a
maybe I'll have to
nominalist
go back.
about handouts. You know, he refers to them, but he
Well, I
doesn't
was-
admit that they exist.
Yeah, I
Here's
listened
the
to it while
thing.
I was out with
If
the
you have
dog,
an
so I didn't
ontology,
have any access to.
if you have an
anything.
ontology that allows for particulars and sets as abstract entities, you have abstraction and you have particulars. Like, I just want to go with tropes at that point. Like, I'm not sure why.
Oh, no, the reason is because you can get sets constructively in a purely abstract way, so it feels less committed. I'm with you in wanting to go that extra step, but I'm just very familiar with Quine being very nominalist, except about sets. So I kind of have an intuition for why
I
you
see.
would think that's a good thing to do. I'm not sure
Yeah.
it's justified, but I have that intuition. Slogans.
Yeah. Slogans.
Yeah, the next slogan is "Truth is grounded." Section 4.
Ugh.
Right. I love how he starts this out. He says, "This shows that TM is in need of justification. How can we justify it? One way would be to derive it from a plausible and compelling idea. And this is what I shall do." It's like, oh my God. Oh yeah, it's great. I thought there were a lot of powerful turns of phrase that can come out into this section to kind of be, I guess, evocative or, intuition pumps for the concept that he's trying to express. Right. So he says, for the root idea of truth makers is the very plausible and compelling idea that the truth of a proposition is a function of or is determined by reality. I mean, he in this section he gives like several different formulations of how we might how we do often talk about these matters. Right. He says. The insight behind the idea of the truth makers is that truth is grounded. Its truth is not a primitive, brute, ultimate fact, but it depends on reality. What reality is like is anterior to the truth of the proposition. It gives rise to the truth of the proposition and thereby accounts for it. And then where he settles, there are a couple that he seems to favor in the end, where he says, truth is determined by reality. That's one formulation that he likes. And then at the end, he just says, from now on, I shall mainly use the formulation in terms of because, right? Which is, in some sense, you might think the most basic or ordinary English manner of articulating this idea of just saying like, well, this is true because of the way things are. Or because of reality.
I like that. But I also like being explicit about grounding, because what I like about the word because is that it is used both for causal determination and grounding determination. And it brings them together for the very good reason that we often employ causal relations and grounding relations for the same purposes, and that there's a certain analogy there waiting to be articulated. So by just using the word because, you're not even limiting yourself to grounding, but just saying, whatever it is that gives us explanations. Elsewhere in the paper, he says, because it is grounding that grounds explanations and not the other way around.
Yeah, it's a big part of the later
I think
paper.
that's a powerful reason to use ultimately just.
Yeah, that was powerful.
Because, and by the way, just using the word because is a kind of one-word slogan. So, truth because reality, kind of like because science.
Mulder.
Yeah.
There was
Yeah.
another slogany aspect of this section that I loved at the top of 231, or the first full paragraph. Thus, the idea that truth is determined by reality sounds grand, but in itself it is a very minimal idea. It is simply the idea that the truth of a truth bearer is determined by its subject matter, or some feature of it, no matter what the nature of the subject matter may be. I love this part, but I think this is wherein lies a lot of the difficulties with the truth making, any truth making theory, because you want some alignment between the content of a proposition and the truth maker for that proposition. But when you get to a lot of the difficult propositions, you feel this need to retreat from the subject matter to find something else, like the totality of the world, some other entity that makes the negative facts true. So as intuitive as
He
this
does
part
say,
is, and I love, that's where
or
all the
some
difficulty
feature of
is.
it. He does say,
What's
or
that?
some feature of it. So it's not just the
But
subject
not
matter.
it. Sometimes it's another entity or some feature of another entity that makes true some proposition, right?
Oh, I see. Well,
It's
okay.
not going to be a feature of, the empty fridge that makes some negative fact about the orange juice in it true. It's going to be whatever's not it. Something that encompasses it. Like in the case of Parsons giving us the Australia example, there's going to be something about a larger mereological whole that makes some part true, but it's going to be something outside of the content of the proposition or truth bearer of that relation. So as intuitive as this very minimal idea is, there's a lot of difficulty in this.
Yeah, fair.
Right. But maybe just reveals that the subject matter of some of these claims is more substantial than we think it is, right? So if a kid asks you, are there unicorns, and you say no, there are no unicorns, and then they say, well maybe in Canada. They're like, no, there are no unicorns. When I say there are no unicorns, I mean there's no unicorns in Canada. So who knew that there are no unicorns included Canada? But you're pretty clear that was, when you meant there's no unicorns. There's no unicorns in Canada. So
I really like. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, but then they might say, well, in stories, and you're like, well, yeah, there's unicorns in stories. So so apparently there are no unicorns had a subject matter that included Canada, but not storybooks, which is interesting.
That's
right?
interesting.
But
yeah.
so that might show the subject matter of propositions is often something worth thinking about. It's maybe not clearly what it says on the tin, right?
Which makes me think
if I say something like this Sharpie's not blue, maybe it's possible that the subject matter is just this Sharpie, right? Whereas you might think it's some other, it's blue, or or something like that, or maybe we need to think about what the subject matter is.
But wouldn't that mean that
Not always clear.
that truth bearers can't just be propositions broadly, but they have to be tokened propositions, and that they always have to be sort of fully specified in the tokening or the indexing, so that you get that necessary whole part relation, so that when you say there's no unicorns, you've tokened that proposition, and then the subject matter will include Canada, United States,
Right.
England, right? And so that becomes the whole that then serves as the subject matter that then makes true, right? The lack of unicorns in all of that then.
That, right.
But then you need to say that it's
Somehow
not just
got into the there.
right, but then it's not just propositions as truth bearers, but tokened propositions or token
Yeah, well, I mean, he's I mean, part of it's both a strength and a weakness of this paper, although I think it's mostly a strength in the way that he wields it, is he tries to be very, very neutral in his presentation of a lot of different things. I mean, he doesn't tell us what propositions are,
Right.
right? So they
They're just
could well
not-
be tokens, right? I mean,
They're distinct from the
he's not-
reality. That's all it gives us.
right?
isn't it?
Yeah, they're just exactly right. Yeah, they're just not.
So he-
exactly.
As a
He
matter of
rejects
fact,
identity theory, but
I take the view
That's
that
about
that whatever we say about propositions typically is always about the tokens, and that we only
Yeah.
speak of types because it's because of the nature of communication requires that we begin with types, and typically for propositions, or at least the typical propositions that we consider, all of the tokens of a given type will have the same truth value, barring the relativization to context given by indexicals. So, so indexicals aside, it's always the token proposition, which means that it isn't an abstraction, but rather that from which we abstract.
Here's my issue with that. So Poling and Davidson, where he says to understand a sentence or proposition is to grasp the truth conditions, it would seem that then proposition types would have different truth-making conditions than tokens, and so it would seem that the content would be different from the types and the tokens, and then in virtue of what are they even the same proposition? That's where I'm not sure. So if if the sentence or the proposition there are no unicorns is made true by Canada when it's expressed in one context, and made true by England when expressed by another context, or within another context, the truth makers are different, the truth conditions are different. In virtue of what are the types and tokens having the same content? Like, how does that even?
It's a good question, but it has a ready answer, which is that it isn't that proposition types have truth conditions, but that they have truth condition functions. In other words, they have a function that yields truth conditions given a context, or rather more explicitly given a token.
Yeah, this is the two-dimensional challenge, which I mean, Davidson was alive long enough to see the beginnings of it, but he never, to my knowledge, responds to those developments. But I mean, it comes up right in the situation that you were talking about, Josh, where the particularities of the tokenings are quite important, because the proposition expressed may be a function of the particular tokening. I mean, certainly if the sentence has an indexical in it, obviously, right? But in general, it's more complicated.
Yeah, so the tokening then makes it easier to understand the asymmetry paragraph, which I think is worth reading out loud. There is an asymmetry implicit in the idea that truth is grounded, namely that while the truth of a proposition is grounded in reality, reality is not grounded in the truth of propositions. Thus, although the truth of the proposition that the rose is red is determined by the roses being red, the roses being red is not determined by the truth of the proposition that the rose is red. One explains the truth of the proposition that the rose is red in terms of the roses being red, but not vice versa. So, yeah, in order for that to make sense, and not reduce grounding to entailment, there's got to be some sense in which the proposition is constituted by, made out of, whatever this turns out to be, what this grounding relation turns out to be. The rose is being red, where the rose is being red is not a cryptic way of talking about propositions again, but instead some entity in the world. And the way, I mean, what occurs to me is to say that the proposition tokens just are things like sentences and mental representations, and sentence tokens, I should say, and mental representation tokens. Which, yeah, it's tricky. I mean, I'm not prepared to speak on that more.
Can I introduce a side note real quick? So I'm quite fond of thinking of propositions as possible mental states. But then this introduces a difficulty in determination versus causation, because mental states as physical states or at least intervening on physical states, would necessarily happen at a time after the cause. So
I was
you're going to
thinking
slip
about
out
that.
of. Were you okay? Yeah, yeah.
Yes, I was.
Well, I mean, on one hand, this solves a lot of the difficulties because you can have something like, this causal composition accounting for both the content and the truth conditions and the truth making relation. And you can get almost something like I've been thinking of like an authenticity count of truth where, if the content of the mental representation just is what the content is about in the way that, an authentic painting has a signature. And if the signature is of the painter who painted the painting, then it's authentic. In the same way, if the content matches the cause of the content, then it's true. So thinking about this sort of synchronic shift, from determination to causation, it might make things a lot easier. But then you've changed the game quite a bit. And I'm not sure if a translation project would go through because now you're not really concerned with determination as metaphysical grounding, but causal something like causal composition. So much so that even in like molecules, it's going to be the interaction of atoms over time. It's going to be the interplay of forces between the parts that then determine the molecule. But it's a determining that's a causing, and all because is once again causal, not non-causal. It's
Okay, so
interesting.
get your beer ready. Um, if the proposition is about something that occurs in the future, right, that's not going to give you the proper direction for the asymmetry we're looking for, right? Like if I say, Trump's not going to win in 24, and I say that today, then to say that that proposition is constitutively determined or otherwise grounded by a future event, right, it's certainly not going to be causal. But it might be causal anyway if we do it on its elements, right? Because that sentence or that proposition will be composed from concepts, and those concepts are
That's right.
causally related to the past
Exactly.
by way of a Fodorian language of thoughts, blah, 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 blah.
That's right. And that's how you would get any sort of negative existential proposition where there would be no mental state of a forever non-existent entity in the world. You would always need something to have existed to have caused the concept, but then you get recombination to grant various, propositions that have not been made true by the world yet. Sorry,
Right, I would rather say composition, not recombination, because I don't want to make this an Armstrong point. I want to keep it Fodorian. But yeah, it's the same idea.
I maybe we could have a break. All that talk of the house having no cat in it reminded me that I have left my cat out. So
you want a break? Okay, let's call a break right now.
And I'm
All right.
Okay. So if YouTube were reaching out to me to figure out how to monetize this thing, that's where we would have put the commercial break. But
Oh my God.
as things are, we have to pay for all the expenses, something like $5-10 out of pocket, which is really
we need
difficult.
like either a wine merchant or vineyard or like hard alcohol sponsor.
That should not be difficult. We will get on that.
we can
But,
do
I
some
mean,
product placement.
Yeah.
We-
Captain
we
Morgan.
could totally
Mhm.
maybe we can just set up to record at a vineyard or like
yeah, that's the way to do it. But Josh,
somewhere
did
in
you
wine
leave
country.
California?
That'd be great.
Are you like in Missouri already, or what's going on?
No, I'm in SF again right now.
Okay, fine. You don't have
For
to
now.
admit it. I mean, that's cool.
Yeah, we should just go up to wine country and record there and then have them.
We should all say we're trying to leave SF because
Sponsor.
that's the truly SF
Yeah.
thing to do. It's to say you want to leave.
It's true.
SF.
It is. There's like a weird, like trendy self-loathing thing now about living in the Bay Area.
It's
Moved to
true.
Miami
I mean,
to
either
become a
they're
fly.
trying to recall like all politicians. All right. Anyways, all right. Like.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
Miami was
true.
taken over by Roger Stone wannabes, so I can't go there.
Oh my God.
Okay. Section 5, against the primitiveness of truth. Yeah, so we did just read Davidson's Truth of
Yeah.
Communication, which is
I
Right.
know.
Mhm.
That's true.
He himself rails against Quine Horwich, not Wright, but he does go against Dummett, and Wright is kind of like that. But Davidson himself does advance the primitiveness of truth. So what do we make of the situation with respect to that? I don't remember.
Well, so truth can't be primitive if
Right.
grounding is primitive, right?
Well, no, here's
Yes,
the
I
thing.
think that is sort of the idea here. Well,
is
in
sort of-
particular, if grounding is primitive and truth making is a form of grounding or something like that.
If truth is grounded on reality, truth can't be primitive, because if truth were primitive, then either they would both be independently grounded or just not require ground, but then they'd have nothing to do with each other, or reality would be grounded on truth. It would be really weird.
Right. You would have a sort of weird pre-existing harmony where the true propositions just happen to be true, and there just happens to be the things in the world that they're about, but there's no connection.
Or some kind of
What have you got
semantic
against Leibniz?
or some kind of semantic idealism.
I will say this. It is
Right.
amazing how
Yeah.
a lot of the crazy ideas in the history of philosophy actually do follow from various positions. And so you see that there are just various figures in history who are willing to make the moves, but they really do follow from various ideas. And people like Leibniz
Yes.
really did accept it and take it. David Lewis really does make the move and accepts concretism, but there's, they're motivated moves, they're justified, and they're there for a reason. And it's
Right. No, this is a sign of philosophical maturity on Josh's part. You read something and you think this is absolutely nuts, and then you review the arguments and you think, well, maybe this test has to be true, but I don't know. Let's consider. Oh, that's what Leibniz is saying. Okay. Yeah. No, that's definitely the case. Yeah. By the way, who's a good example of this radical semantic idealism? Is it Brandon?
maybe.
I don't know. Nelson Goodman?
Well, there's
That's my
I
best
think
guess.
there's a footnote. There's a footnote in Wilson where she argues that maybe maybe I'm misunderstanding what she's doing with this point, but she refers to that maybe Aristotle's naval battle tomorrow example might be an instance where that could motivate someone to thinking that true propositions come before the reality or I don't know.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know who it might be. Right. So
Well,
you might think that
I mean,
somehow
there's always Derrida.
or maybe some sort of maybe some sort of if you combine that case with a certain kind of Christianity, you might say, well, look, the truths are written out by God beforehand, right? Like God has kind of dictated what's going to happen in the universe, and then it unfolds according to the plan. Maybe, I don't know.
Do you even have to be that extreme? I mean, if you think that anything about the content of a concept is determined by some sort of like appropriate inference, it seems like that's enough to kind of lead to an idealism like this, right?
Like
Where
Brandon.
if you say like the
Wait, what do you mean?
Well, if contents aren't determined by the world, but are determined by inferences, but there's some sort of link to the world, I still don't know what Brandon has in mind yet. But
Right.
the conditions which it would be appropriate to apply a concept are in fact determined by the first making true of a concept or something. Like if it I don't know
what
what
Brandon thinks either. I'm just trying to get you to drink because we did agree that would be another drinking.
Random.
Well, I guess what I have in mind broadly, I don't know how to bridge them, but it's something like with, mental talk, intentional talk. So if you have to first have an intention to act, to cause the action, there is something about, the intention to, pee that then causes pee. So it's first the intentional state that then causes
Bad choice of letter.
right? So like
Intention to pee causes a pee.
well, I intend to raise my hand makes true, the raising of my hand, right? And so if you think all concepts are the sort of inferences, like the content just are the inferences, then the sort of intentionally upholding of it might then make it appropriate to then employ the concept. I don't know. I'm not sure. But I'll just drink more.
Anyway. It's supposed to be an unattractive enough position that we reject it and accept that the priority goes reality to truth and not the other way around. for the direction.
I think
Right.
we're all super on board here on this one.
What about
Okay,
like
so
pragmatists though, like the usefulness of, you know, the outcome of some belief? What if then, you know, a community determines what is useful and then that determines what is true?
doesn't pragmatism
Yeah,
have
I
to be
mean,
useful first?
I
Well,
guess
it might
there
be
could
useful to
be
satisfy external requirements always, right? So if somebody sets some like insane arbitrary, like on a game show or something, but a game show the size of like a Truman Show, then it would become useful to then believe the things that the arbitrary game show, you know, sets out as being appropriate, and then you're believing them, then it leads to beneficial outcomes or usefulness. Then the truthfulness as
I can't.
usefulness.
I can't.
right. I think well,
I'm trying.
I think two things. I think that there could be, you know, theories of truth that don't think that there's this direction of fit from reality to truth,
Right.
but they might not accept the truth maker principle at all, right? So they might not think that there's a connection between reality and truth such that you can talk about truth making reality get shaped either, right? It's, you know, truth might be in relationship with something, with other truths, but not with reality per se, or with human endeavor and not with reality per se. But then he also talks earlier about how even idealists can accept TM, right? It's just that they deny that the entities which
Right.
make propositions true are mind independent, right? So it could be that the entities which make things true are human pragmatic concerns, but they're still
That's
entities,
right.
right?
Yeah.
So either they could do it, in which case the pragmatist would probably still say it's reality to truth because those pragmatic concerns are part of reality, or pragmatic issues or whatever. So yeah.
Okay, so then there's two sections called the Why Truth Makers.
I wonder if there isn't, sorry, just before we go on, I wonder if there isn't some more subtlety about the seeming disagreement that Davidson would have here. Because, you know, Davidson is always saying, you know, truth is a primitive, but he's talking about he's talking about defining what you know, the concept of truth, more so than the idea that you know, token truths, you know, don't have relations to anything else in the world or something like that. Obviously, he doesn't think that tokenings of truths don't relate to other things in the world. It's more that he has some. It's that he thinks it's logically primitive in the sense that it's unanalyzable, but that isn't the same thing as unrelatable.
Mm.
So I don't know. It's not clear to me that it's quite
So you think Davidson
on a par. I'm not sure.
Davidson is concerned with the notion or concept of truth, while the target here is truth as the actual relation, like the ontological status of truth, or the property of a proposition. I'm not sure I follow.
What I mean is, you know, it's not as though he doesn't mean to give theory of truth, right? He just doesn't think it's reducible to anything.
Right, but that's a conceptual point. I mean, it might.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah,
Right,
the concept of truth.
So that's what I'm not sure that's the same target here in this paper, is it? When he says truth.
That is my point. I'm not sure that when we say primitive in one setting, we mean the same thing.
In other words, they might not be at odds. They might not be that far apart.
It's not clear to me.
I see. Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Although, actually, if by true we have in mind this truth making relation of in virtue of, he does say that is oddly a primitive notion, which is in agreement with Davidson, right? So
Truth making is a primitive notion. Yeah,
If the
well, the
inverse
in virtue of is,
and he
yeah.
says it's in virtue of that something is true. So I'm wondering if maybe they're actually not far apart.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if Davidson admitted of truth making, I can't imagine he wouldn't want to say
Right, but he does
that it was primitive. Yeah.
but he does explicitly, at least in truth and predication, reject truth making. So
Right. Yeah.
yeah. I don't know.
All right. Why truth makers won?
Because ways are entities.
Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. So this is where he's cashing out the how things are rather than whether things are.
I really liked the middle of 233, immediately after basically concluding that ways are entities, ways that the rose might be. It might be red, it might be white. He says, but perhaps one can account for what makes the proposition that the rose is red true without reifying ways. And then it goes by way of instantiation, which brings to mind the third man argument.
Right.
But he concludes with, but this only helps if for the rose to instantiate the property of being red is not for it to instantiate the property of being light. And this should not mean that there is an entity of the rose instantiating being red, distinct from another entity, the rose instantiating being light, for that means reifying how things are. And reifying how things are is admitting truth makers. So it strikes me that the third man argument might be an early version of trying to avoid this reification, these entities. But that if you do, you just become a trope theorist. And so it occurs to me to ask, is being a trope theorist a kind of sidestepping of the third man argument?
I don't think so. Because if you reify these aspects or features of an entity, if you reify them, they become entities. But then um, the entity owner has some relation to that feature as entity. And so you need another entity as relation, or as Karen was getting at in the beginning, another notion of grounding, that's determination, that's distinct from this notion of grounding that he's using for truth making. So no, this is still a problem. You either keep getting relations on relations as entities on entities, or you need another type of grounding. So you need to be a grounding pluralist. So this does introduce a
Well,
problem.
I don't
this might be
understand
some of
that.
the motive.
Because if
You
the
don't understand
entity, no, because if the entity encompasses the relation as a whole that has
Well,
the
notice
lat on
that
its
these aren't.
parts, then you don't need another relation.
Well, yeah, right. No, I mean, notice that these aren't tropes as we would classically think about them. If anything, there's something like abstract particular states of affairs, right?
Well,
You
I don't
know,
know
the
how
rose
you
is
think
being.
about, I don't know how you think about tropes, but one way to think about tropes is as grounding the universe, the abstract universals. The abstract universals just becomes the class of all the abstract particulars.
Right, but the abstract the tropes are still, well, actually I suppose it depends on whether you're a bundle theorist or not, right?
Exactly.
Right.
What the hell's a bundle?
That's actually the deeper issue, sort of issue here. If you are not a bundle theorist, then there's this further question as to how the tropes are relating to the particular, whatever that is. You know, that they are tropes of or properties of. You know, but if you're a bundle theorist,
And that's it.
then the issue, well, no, then the issue is how to explain the
bundle,
the compresence, you know, of the
right.
It's just
tropes.
Plural, it's just plural quantification. You're just, when you speak of an object, a bundle, a rose, you're just quantifying over all of its abstract particulars at once.
So the bundle is like the domain of quantification?
No, it's not the domain because there can be many roses.
No. It's
Bundle.
the bundle is no, it's not the yeah, it's not that it's the domain of quantification. It's one of the things ranged over by the plural quantifier.
Exactly.
The plural quantifier, yeah. That's interesting.
The point is that you don't need a real relation. I mean, what do I mean by real relation? An internal relation, that's what I mean. You don't need some internal relation in your metaphysical account to do the plural quantification. The plural quantification can just be, the way of talking about all these abstract particulars at the same time. That's all.
Well,
And you do that as motivated by the causal relations or constitutive relations that they have among them, which is motivated by their compresence. Their compresence being nothing more than a way of summing up the fact that it's the co-located abstract particulars that will manifest the truths that relate all of these particulars to one another. I just don't see a regress. That's basically what I just said.
For trope specifically.
Yeah, obviously for.
I mean, I think the third man
account
argument
of instantiation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right.
Sorry, it's a bit of a digression, but I just wanted to.
Well, it's not really, because this has been something that's bugged me about tropes after reading Davidson, is wondering what the nature of this bundling is. And I'm not, I mean, hearing about, as simple as plural quantification doesn't quite seem to answer the metaphysical problem to me. So it doesn't seem to answer the question. And it seems that Davidson's complaints about relations still holds.
I postpone until we read Vlastos because he analyzes Plato's argument formally. Actually, if I might just say this right now, I haven't finished the Vlastos paper, but I read 2/3 of it. It's from the 1950s. And though it's not famous, I had never heard of it before, I would happily submit it as a exemplary well, I was going to say example. A very fine example of what analytic philosophy is all about, especially in relation to prior methodologies or schools of thought, because he takes a famous argument, the third man argument from Plato, and analyzes it. And what does that mean? He turns it into logic as well as he can, leaves the predicates that he can't turn into logic where they are, highlights them, puts them under a microscope, and then tells us what happens over the course of 20 pages. It's just brilliant. It's brilliant.
Why don't we read it
I
here?
look forward to it. Sorry?
Yeah, I mean, that particular paper may not be super famous, but Vlastos is famous.
He is, but not as an analytic philosopher. He's known as a Platist.
No, right. Well, he's known for reviving ancient philosophy, basically.
Really?
Interest in Plato, interest in Plato, and in particular for the theory of how to separate out the early, middle, and late period, and his theory of like what's really more what he thought of as Socrates' voice versus Plato's voice coming through. Yeah.
But wasn't Davidson's critique that Plato didn't have a concept of relations, just entities? So to analyze the relation or instantiation relation is to introduce another entity. But that's where, if you analyze it in modern terms, you could say they're entities and relations, and you get away from the third man argument, right? You just have to.
Well, sure. No, that's actually a very good point. And he does talk about that. Basically, what he says is Plato doesn't have a good sense of relations. And so that's why we analyze the argument this way to be faithful to Plato. But at the same time, we're interested in whether we should take away from this exposition, and no, that's not right. Whether we should take away from this traditional argument against universals anything that has validity for us, given that we do accept relations.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But all of these topics we've been covering do seem to reduce to this problem of not predication or problem of universals, but the problem of relations. Like, what the hell is a relation? Are there many? Is there one? Is it fundamental? Is it unanalyzable? Is the notion unanalyzable, but the actual thing in the world analyzable? Like, what are relations? Because if you just grant that they're entities and relations, it seems like a lot of these problems of predication, truth making, universals all kind of just go away. And it's sort of like, weren't those people back in that time silly? They didn't have a accurate theory of relations. Like, yeah, actually, that is still the problem. We don't know what relations are.
Well,
Well, analytic philosophy was birthed over a disagreement about relations, right?
I think I know what a relation is, but I can't say that I know what anyone else's problems with relations are. So that's my ignorance.
Yeah.
So what else do we have in why truth makers won?
I mean, should we, it seems like the heart of it is the top of 233. Maybe it's worth going through because that's the biggest, I think, most important argument of the paper.
Yeah, you're right.
Where he says at the top 233. So to review, Dodd's counterexample was that you can have two universes where you have, in both universes, you have the same entities because you've got the rows, particular rows that we were talking about. You've got the property red, you've got the property white. It's just in one universe, the rows instantiates red, and in the other universe, you've got the relationship of instantiation. But in one universe, the rows instantiates red, and in the other universe, the rows instantiates white, but they're all the same entities, right? So here's the taking it on 233. So the rose is many ways. One way the rose is to be red, another way the rose is to be light, and so on. Once we've distinguished the different ways the rose is, we can say that the proposition that the rose is red is true in virtue of the roses being a certain way, namely being red, while the proposition that the rose is light is true in virtue of the roses being a different way, namely being light. If so, what makes a certain predication of the rose is a certain way the rose is. But to distinguish ways presupposes that we can identify them, count them, and quantify over them. But if one can identify, count, and quantify over ways, then ways exist. That is, ways which are truth makers are entities, right? So basically, how things are is a matter of what there is, because how things are is the way things are, and ways are entities because you can count them, you can pick them out and identify them, you can quantify over them. And so, we go from the slogan that truth making is about how things are, not what things are, to back to truth making is about what things are, because how things are is about what things are. I think that's pretty much the main argument of the paper.
Right. Yeah. So he rehabilitates the principle, and by saying, by showing us how there are more entities being quantified over than Dodd may have supposed.
So how is
so those aren't those worlds where the very same rose is red in one and white in the other do not have the same entities, right? Because there's the rose being red is an entity in one, and there's a rose being white, which is a different entity in the other.
Even though it's stated very generally, I have a hard time understanding what that entity would be, except in terms of abstract particulars, which I don't even have to think of as especially abstract. In fact, the more I think about abstract particulars, the more I think that they are that they must supervene on concrete particulars too. So the redness of a rose, though it is abstract, perhaps in our though we may treat it as abstract in our conception of it, may necessarily supervene on something concrete, namely, light properties, and sorry, not properties, but specific light of specific wavelengths. Those are entities.
Yes. Well, I think there's two issues there about whether or not the redness of the rose as a way supervenes on more than like the surface structure of the rose, but has to supervene on things like, or whatever the right word is, like ambient light,
Oh,
the
I
way
meant the
human
surface
eyeballs
anyway.
function, those sorts of things.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Yeah, but
What
I mean,
about
I meant the surface and the eyes and the light. But the point
I
is
mean, I
overall
think it is, yeah, it is interesting what the entity that is the redness of the rose, or the way that is the rose being red, maybe that whatever that entity is, whether or not it has a relationship with the rose itself, or whether the rose is a part, or whether the way the rose is being read is a part of the rose, right? Which was, I guess, what trope theory might suggest,
exactly
or whether
right.
so, and so those are the questions that I was saying at the end. I'm interested in those connections between these ways, now that we think of them as entities in the world, ways of being, or ways of states of affairs, or whatever they tropes, whatever they cash out to be, such that in one universe where you've got the rose being red, you've got a different entity than in a universe where the rose is white.
But my
You know,
question
what the connection is between those entities and other kinds of entities that we more commonly think of, like roses,
right.
shades of red.
But my question is, if it isn't something like abstract or concrete entities having, constituted by, in this particular case, the the eye, surfaces, and light, what else would it be? I mean, what else would it be but a part of the rose? I can, in the abstract, of course, articulate how we might express what the other options are, but realistically, do we even have an image of what the alternative is?
well, what about
I don't
something?
know that it can.
I was gonna say, what about something like vibrating? Any sort of like state over time of an entity being the
Yeah,
way of its being. It wouldn't be an entity above him. It wouldn't be an entity that makes true, but it would be something like that entity over time making true proposition, right?
that's just another entity extended over time.
Yeah,
Is it?
I don't think
I
that
have a very loose
the
sense of entity.
I mean, I do too. I'm happy to allow in all kinds of crazy things as entities. So I'm happy for states of affairs or ways to be entities. But I don't think that the redness of the rose is a sort of traditional part of the rose, like the surface, because the surface will also have other properties that could be pulled away from the redness, right? So the surface of the rose might be quite dull, but it might be the same red if it was more shiny or something like that, assuming that shininess doesn't necessarily change the color.
Yeah.
Or it might be cold or something like that, right? Or
Yeah,
warm.
no, it's
So
true.
yeah, so the ways would come apart from any particular traditional part of the rose.
But
Okay, so now we have the slogans. Are you ready for part two?
Yes, let's have some slogans.
Okay, so the argument is: 1, truth is grounded. 2, grounding is a relation. 3, relations link entities. 4, therefore, truth is grounded in entities.
Yeah,
Who-
this
So
is great.
he's not resisting this. He likes it. Who's
Mhm.
resisting it? And in what way exactly? He wants to address himself to people who accept the first one, with the exception of no, there's no exception here. He wants to address himself to those who accept one, and then just consider the possibility of denying 2 or 3 in order to be able to deny 4. And 3 looks like it gets ruled out pretty quickly. I still remember absurd arguments with so-called what are they called? Structural ontology. The layman.
Structural realism?
Is that what they're called? Yes, that's right. Structural realism. ontological structural realism.
The ontic structural realism,
Yeah,
or whatever.
yes. Ontic structural realism. People who say that it can all be relations.
Everything must go.
Yeah,
is the
relations all the
slogan,
way
right?
down, basically.
Yeah.
Which is,
Right.
relations without relata is, I don't know. It's like a hot
Begging
dog
for
without-
infinitism.
It's like a hot dog without the bun or the sausage. I just don't get it. So you can try to give up two, and that's where he puts his effort.
Yeah. Can I just say that you might hesitate on three because I guess it depends on what you think entities are, like how to claim something, give something entity status, how much it
I take entities to be the
how much
biggest-
follows, right? I mean, because do
category.
you think that means that we have to sort of accept Meinong's jungle of any object of thought, because the mind can have a relationship with it, must exist somewhere, or not? He says it doesn't exist, but it or it exists, it does, it's yeah, some other world, but it has some sort of status. What's the contrast that Meinong draws between
Is it the
existence
real, but they
and
don't
the real, but they don't exist? Yeah. So you have to sort of give them reality or something like that. So you might say, well, no, we have to give them existence or something. Yeah, they're non-existent, but real objects, right? And so if something isn't, yeah. So if you think
there's three realms or something, right? Like
right.
the existent,
so,
the subsistent, and the inexistent, or something like that. I don't know.
Right. So if I can be in a relationship with unicorns because I like unicorns, does that mean, okay, unicorns are clearly there for an entity? So does that mean, I have to make room for them in my, like, what kind of room do I have to make for them in my ontology? Do I have
Well, I mean,
to?
the room you make for them is to simply call them possibilia, and they could be concrete, they could be abstract, but I think you have to admit them if you admit of a possible world's ontology. That doesn't mean you have to go the way of
Right. So you
Meinong's
could
way of
say,
doing
well,
it
then
exactly,
relations
because
can.
he has other ideas about the objects of thought, which go further than what is demanded by a modal account in terms of possibilities, possible worlds.
Right. So does that, so if you want to say possibilia are entities, is that, what kind of claim is that? Does that imply some sort of modal realism about them, or
Not
I mean, I'm quite
concretism,
happy to think that,
but
that
yes.
entities don't mean, that they have any kind of existence.
Well, they have
Except
existence,
other than-
just not at the actual world. They have existence at the possible world that.
Yeah, I don't like that kind of talk either.
Well, it's Kripke's way of talking.
See, that's why I'm summing.
Well, I mean, Kripke will just say that you sometimes think that you're expressing a proposition, but you're not, right? So,
right. Okay, so that
in reference to unicorns, or rather not.
So I can't really be in the
unicorns.
relationship of, liking to unicorns, because relationships do involve links between entities, but there is no such entity as a unicorn.
You can be mistaken about it, or you can pretend that you are for him. But yeah.
Right. So he would still accept that relations have to be between entities. So you're pretending there's you're pretending there's a relationship. Whereas
you're just mistaken that you're related to anything in that case.
Right. Whereas you could say, well, relations are they have two places or three places. So they're but other things besides entities could go in one of the places, like a concept or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't.
But I guess a concept could be an entity. Yeah, I don't know.
I thought Kripke's point here was about fictional names, but
no, he speaks about both fiction in the sense of literature, but also fiction in the sense of false science.
Mm-hmm.
It's annoying he doesn't. There should be more standard terminology to disambiguate, but yeah.
At any rate, there's got to be somewhere to
yeah.
cash out liking unicorns, whether it's pretense or
Right,
uh,
right.
non-actual relations,
Yeah.
or names as descriptions, whatever it is, you're still relating entities in the broadest possible sense of some category. So yeah, I take entities to just be what Quine talks about when he says that it's whatever we're ranging over in our quantifiers, except that we're not limited to extensional quantifiers. So yeah, so I'm not sympathetic to denials of three, though I understand
Right.
we can talk about it, but he's not sympathetic either. So I just kind of want to let it go. Because here's a
Yeah.
slogan. I remember his slogan, oriented programming, since nothing relates anything to nothing. I mean, who's going to deny that?
Yeah.
Well, nothing
That's
comes from
good.
nothing, so it's linked to itself.
Yeah.
That's the great thing about slogans. There's always a counter slogan. In the election.
It sounds very Heideggerian.
We need to sublate the synth slogan.
I guess the sound
the
of
nothing
music.
that nothings or whatever.
Yes. My favorite use of that phrase is the sound of music. So.
All right, let's go to the second premise.
Right. So okay. So one he defended in the Why Truthmakers won. 3 is generally hard to give up. So 2 seems to be and 4 is just the conclusion. So 2 seems to be the one to look at.
2 is the soft on your belly.
Yeah. Right. So.
Oh, I know where he's from. He's from Argentina because he uses Diego Maradona as an example. No one else would do that.
I had to look it up.
Yeah.
Soccer player.
Did you find the bit about the hand?
The hand of God.
1864 to 1980 something hand of.
It's pretty good. I love it. So okay, so what does he say here? So he gets to premise 2 like halfway down 235.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, I guess the hand of God must be an entity, because to metaphorically have the hand of God is to be in a relation with the hand of God, right?
So he just says grounding is a relation, and then he said, right, and it's asymmetric. You know, it has these features that we've kind of like logically articulated, right? And then he just says, well, so the relation in question, which holds between certain entities in the world and propositions, is no other than that of making true, or that of being true in virtue of.
Okay, so in response to Davidson, one thing that could be said is that for the truth of the proposition that the rose is red to be grounded and the rose is being red, is for that proposition to be true if and only if the rose is red. But this is wrong, for it does not respect the asymmetry of grounding.
Yeah.
That's what he says to Davidson.
Yeah, I mean, the T biconditionals are symmetric. It's like.
And notice that Davidson tries
that
to
is the
ground
nagging
things
thing.
in belief, right? To which there's another response here, namely that if anything, it should be the beliefs that are grounded in the truth-making relation.
Yeah.
He doesn't put it that way. He puts it in terms of explanation. But if belief attribution for Davidson is a consequence of interpretation, and we explain by interpreting, then I think the arguments he gives against Horwich would apply. I mean, this all strikes me as very, very intuitive and difficult to resist. And in fact, in reading this, mostly what I learned is, what is it everyone else is thinking? Because it never occurred to me to doubt any of this.
Yeah.
Are there any, do you have any ideas or questions about any of this before we get to the counterfactual bit? Because I needed help with that in the middle of 236.
No, I mean, I think,
I mean, just, tune in on Sunday because Wilson will attack the idea that grounding is always asymmetrical.
Okay.
sure.
Okay, so let me just read this out loud. It might be suggested that the rose is being red explains the truth of the proposition that the rose is red because certain counterfactuals hold. If the rose had not been red, then the proposition that the rose is red would not have been true. Do I think this?
Is this what Armstrong thinks?
No, I think this is what Lewis thinks, and he's arguing against this. Oh, sorry. Is it Armstrong? What Armstrong thinks? No, I don't think so. But I'm not sure because, well, we did read Armstrong on modal truth making, but I forgot what he said. What did he say?
I think Armstrong's what is open to the possibility that it goes both ways, the grounding, the connection between truth and. Was that one of the things he said in passing? That
Well, he doesn't talk about grounding, so it's not clear. His truth making accounts are modal.
right, their entailment star or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think he's happy for it to go both ways. But anyway,
I don't know.
I
Anyway,
don't know
so
about
it
this
says-
counterfactual stuff.
Anyway, he says, hold on a second. So I don't think, okay, here's my view, I think. I would say that it's that counterfactuals hold the grounds, the truth of a proposition, since holding is itself just the truth of a certain kind of proposition, but rather that certain certain entities or counterfactual entities, that is, entities that would have been, exist at, or rather would have existed, that make true certain propositions. So that the proposition that the rose is red is made true by the very entity that would not have existed had the proposition not been true. But that's not about the counterfactual holding, it's about existence of some entity, even though it's related to counterfactuals. Anyway, he says this is wrong. First, that the relevant counterfactuals hold is simply that they are true. Yeah, I acknowledge that. And so this approach attempts to explain truth by truth. Yeah, okay, that's correct. Second, that if the proposition that the rose is red had not been true, then the rose would not have been red is no less true than that if okay, so he's like, I suppose this is an argument against trying to have counterfactuals do what would otherwise, having counterfactuals do the work of accounting for the hows and how things are, as opposed to whether things are. But
Well,
yeah.
This is specifically the counterfactuals as the ground.
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah.
Right.
Well, actually, it's not the counterfactuals of the ground. It's that the counterfactuals hold is the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why I felt like you don't have to put it that way. I don't know why he does put it that way. You could just say the counterfactual rather than saying that it holds. You could just say that the rose is red because if the rose had not been red, then the proposition of the...
Does his argument
because the
hold?
counterfactual is
still,
just a
though?
proposition.
Well, no, because if you say the counterfactual holds, you are bringing in truth to explain the truth-making relation. But if you remove the
Yes,
holding and
yeah.
just say because of the counterfactuals, is his response still the same?
Yes.
The
Because
second one is still relevant because the second response, because he's saying that the asymmetry isn't upheld.
Right, right.
right.
So how is that supposed to work?
So if you switch the proposition, you also switch the counterfactual. So it's symmetrical, not the asymmetry of the in virtue of relation.
Right, because we're still talking about,
because if the he's saying like if the counterfactual had been false, then the proposition would be false. Is that what?
It's biconditional, so it would go both ways. You change the proposition, you change the counterfactual. Change the counterfactual, you change the proposition.
so yeah, so grounding can't be this counterfactual business, because we're trying to defend that grounding is a relation. And we're trying, and this is a suggestion that grounding isn't a relation, grounding is a kind of counterfactual claim. But if the counterfactual claim that is the most likely candidate is bidirectional, then it can't be grounding. Doesn't have the asymmetry that we need.
Right.
So that can't be grounding. So we need to, let's go back to the idea that grounding is a relation instead of being a counterfactual claim.
But I was proposing.
Actually, that's not
this
actually. Oh, this is interesting. This betrays a certain claim or assumption about his position about propositions, which he doesn't say. Although I guess it's very common. But this here suggests that it can't be token sentences because, or at least they can't be. They have to already be something which is interpreted. Because you might think that, because otherwise it might be the case that the proposition that the rose is red might not have been true because it meant something else or something like that, right? It has to already be interpreted as meaning what we typically mean when we say that the rose is red or whatever. Like, because when you switch the direction, when you switch the parts of the counterfactual, the antecedent and the consequent, it might be that the antecedent, when the antecedent for that the rose is red would not have been true, that might not be the case in many different ways. It might not be the case because the rose isn't red, or it might not be the case because it means something else, which is false. And yet the rose is red. There are two different ways, depending on what you are interpreting a proposition to be, that a proposition might fail to be true, either because the truth condition changed or because the meaning changed.
But if the meaning changes, isn't that a different proposition?
That's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is
so they're already
implicitly what this means. Yeah, implicitly what this means is, that it can't be like some sort of token view, which is, not yet interpreted or something like that, a token sentence view. Whatever the proposition is here, it has to be fully interpreted already in context or whatever, which is fine, but it's just a thing to keep in mind. If you're concerned about propositions being abstract entities or something like that, I don't know if that concerns you, Josh, but
what does? So these have to be essentially like express propositions already, or whatever.
You have to be, whatever it is that is at the end point of meaning, of a meaning making.
The end point of interpretation.
Yeah, the end point of interpretation. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that is interesting. Yeah. Right.
This is
Though this is being rejected as an account of grounding, right? So
right, yeah, he's saying, because he's saying that the counterfactual isn't discerning enough because it doesn't have the asymmetry.
Right, but that he's
Who's that?
interpreting counterfactuals this way betrays
Yeah.
how we
Okay.
That's yeah.
treatment.
Right.
Which is
Right,
fine. No, I mean
type
that's probably the
differentiation.
most common view of propositions.
Yeah, no,
Probably. I'm
that's
just saying.
interesting.
But
Actually, yeah.
whose account is he
Yeah.
rejecting exactly?
Isn't that the point of talking about
This
propositions?
is
Right.
yeah. So he doesn't name anybody in this section, so I don't know.
Okay, but okay, fine. But like what piece
Right.
is, but what
I'm
piece
torn.
is actually,
Like when you read
piece is
Jessica
actually being
Wilson,
rejected?
Jessica Wilson cites everybody in every footnote, and it's annoying. And this guy cites no one, and it's annoying.
Oh my God, yeah, the
So-
footnotes in Wilson, soul destroying,
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
they're killer,
soul
right? Yeah.
destroying.
So
Yeah.
this Sunday we're
Yeah.
finishing the paper, and for the Sunday next, we'll do the footnotes.
Right.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
Kenny, who do you think this is? Is it people who think that propositions just are sets of possible worlds? Is this Lewis or is it somebody else? Because everybody has views on counterfactuals. I'm not sure what's going on here.
Could it be someone who believes ST or ST star captures all there is to truth making? Or something like that.
Not a bad guess.
You know, that it's these kind of
I'm not-
counterfactuals.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It may there are people I think that try to put counterfactuals.
At the heart of grounding.
Yeah, well, no, well, I was going to say at the heart of the way that
Look,
they
there are
explain
people who
modality.
there are people who
I'm
put
not sure who
counterfactuals
they
at the
are.
heart of the because of causation.
Yeah, right.
So shouldn't there be people who put counterfactuals at the heart of the because of in virtue of?
Yeah, isn't this just Hume's like second account of causation plus ST? Right?
Whatever. Moving on for me. Okay, the next part, the next two paragraphs are really nice. This is where he gets that beautiful slogan, grounding is what makes possible, and the grounds explanation. I would have preferred just grounding grounds explanation. You know, it's cute and it makes sense.
This is a really interesting point, actually. This whole relation between grounding and explanation, especially because we've read so much on causal explanation. And then to see that maybe explanation can't even get off the ground until you have a grounding relation. Maybe it's grounding that actually enables explanation.
Oh, no, I don't think that's the point. It's that there are two kinds of explanations, causal and other kinds. And if
Well, no, I
it's
mean,
other
in the
kind-
sense of scientific explanation about things like molecules and anything where determination or composition comes in
yeah, that
to,
kind.
to scientifically explain what a molecule is, you need to presuppose a grounding relation. So you can't
Right.
invert it and say, we're going to explain grounding in terms of explanation, because you can't even get this
Right.
constitutive explanation off the ground without some sort of grounding. That's fascinating. I mean, that was the one thing that kind of pulled me back towards truth making and towards grounding. This is a very interesting point. Very interesting. I don't know what to
Yeah,
make of it.
I think it's critical. It's again the usual keeping your epistemology and ontology separately.
Yeah.
Separate, I mean.
But this sort of underwrites the idea that the way the world is actually underwrites, epistemology, which is how it should be. So if you're tempted to sort of switch it and say that no, grounding just has to do with what we can explain, you've sort of conflated your epistemology with metaphysics. But yeah, this kind of puts it right in order, gives us a reason why, and yeah, it feels right. It feels like it puts everything right, which is quite nice.
Yep. And then he cancels Quine. Right. Okay, not cancels. I just see the word cancel somewhere. The cancel linguistic reference. Okay, so anyway, he's criticizing Quine's disquotational view, and beautifully by citing Quine. Okay, he says, in the same pages where he was putting forward the disquotational view, Quine admitted the truth was grounded. He says, no sentence is true, but reality makes it so. Hello, you just gave it up right there.
Right.
So then he elaborates to make the point, but that's pretty much it.
I'm so confused by this.
Why?
Well, so I know what Quine says. So yes, I mean, this is like amazing, this section, but so the idea that Quine is using this grounding and then kind of going on to present this sort of disquotational account of truth, and then Donald Davidson says, he's going to go a little bit further than Quine, but then still deny truth making. And then when I see them, you've all seen the interview with both of them together talking, and Donaldson like presses Quine like, what is truth? And like, do you think there's something beyond semantics? And he just stammers for like 8 hours and then finally says something like intersubjectivity. um, but then I read this and I think, okay, so what are those guys talking about? Like, this argument here is so clear and it's so like indicting.
They're
I'm
just,
just wondering what the confusion is, what the struggle is. Is
yeah,
it just a try like scruples of not wanting to say too much?
yes,
Is that
yes,
all it
that's it.
is?
That's all it is.
Okay.
It's not that they have opposing views, or rather views opposed to what we're reading here. It is that their first priority is not to overreach,
Overreach, right?
and to do this by the lights of Humean scruples, suitably refined and sophisticated by centuries of attention to the issue.
Yeah.
Whereas the present perspective, not attributable to him, but really attributable to just being post 1970s, is, maybe we don't have to worry so much about knowledge, because the whole reason for the scruples was to avoid saying something dumb. Don't go all Hegel, don't go all Leibniz. God forbid you go all Plato. Like, don't say anything you can't justify. I think that's the driving spirit. But once you have a few decades of saying only very reasonable things, and also wanting to not so much go beyond science as to tighten it up, then you don't have to worry so much. Then the worry becomes, how do you even say what you want to say? And do you really want to say there's no such thing as truth? So it's like,
Right.
what is the bigger worry? To overreach or to leave truth out? That depends on where you're coming from. If you're coming from Quine's perspective, he's saying, of course truth is important. One of his books is called The Pursuit of Truth. It's not
Right.
called The Pursuit of Truth in L. Okay.
Right.
But when he goes, but that's just rhetoric. When he goes into the details, he does say truth in L. So the alternative view is to say, of course, we don't want to reach in our knowledge seeking. And of course, we want our epistemology to be responsible. But it would be worse to pretend that we have only truth in L and we don't have truth. So
But
it's like
but I suppose,
you're both you're trying to reach the summit of a mountain, right? Where all the problems are solved. You can either do it from here where you don't overreach, or you can do it from here where everything makes sense.
but there's an alternative interpretation instead of this scruples interpretation, which is one that I'm sort of tormented by, and it's the more Wittgensteinian idea of, of of just stopping. There's no more you can say, right? Just be silent. And it's when you've analyzed language in the way that Quine, of course, was doing, you reach that limit. And then there are certain assumptions like, yeah, of course there is a world beyond semantics, but if we then go on to make claims about it, we're making these semantic statements that we then can't analyze outside of some framework. And so it's not just like a scruples point, it's just like you're kind of doing something wrong at that point. There's a sense in which you
How is
just
that
can't.
not just more scruples?
But this is the
Granted,
point
it's
of,
not motivated by Hume, but by Wittgenstein, but it still seems like scruples about what you can and can't do. One's
I mean, this is
epistemic, the other is linguistic.
right, but I think there's something about in the Wilson paper she cites, I think it might have been Fine who used the phrase sincere metaphysics. And it seems to me at a certain point when you're doing this sincere metaphysics, you're kind of abusing language because you're kind of reaching beyond quantification, between all these like beautiful um, analyses of natural language, or supposedly, and you're kind of getting into like unanalyzable natural language terms where you're speaking sincerely about the world as it is, but just making all types of weird mistakes and you can't prove and you can't formalize. And so maybe that just is a mistake. So there, on one hand, it's like sincere metaphysics, you got to do it. And on the other hand, it's like, no, 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 no. There is nothing beyond language. and then the way the world is, but all we can do with philosophy is language, and that's it.
But
And
this
I'm
is
not
the
sure.
interpretation I'm offering. I think you've just refined it. So what I'm saying is you come from you either you're trying to be sincere and within your limits at the same time.
Right.
But it's difficult to do both. So you can either stay within your limits, whether they are epistemic or linguistic, or you can be sincere and worry about fitting within the limits as you go. And I just think that what's motivating this criticism of Quine is to begin with the sincerity. And it might be that he oversteps, but then that's where we criticize him. Whereas Quine, you can't criticize on overstepping because he's very
Right.
careful.
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
And yet he did overstep. He says no sentence is true, but reality makes us so. The only way he can get away with that is that sometimes he's just speaking rhetorically, which is in other words, it's just his way of saying this is where I want to go. But it's not the technical claim.
Yeah, I love this other quote. As Quine said, the truth predicate serves as a reminder that though propositions, I think he said sentences, are mentioned, reality is still the whole point. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah.
There's something very beautiful about knowing your limits and staying within them, with all the while having the ambition not to be restrained, but to do everything that your prior ambition had set out, but within those limits. I think motivated by the faith that whatever those limits are will be sufficient. It's just that within one career, maybe you can't get as far as you'd like. But then the presumption is that maybe, next generation can pull it off. I don't know. I feel very passionately about all of this because I transitioned. I'm trans basically. So I used to be all about scruples, and then I became all about sincerity. And I didn't give up on my scruples. I just flopped them now because I'm more concerned to be sincere and then to remember the scruples and try to fit them in after the fact.
It's a good thing we're like 2.5 hours in before you said
Won't YouTube still somehow interpret the audio and flag for something ridiculous like
I'm also queerly curious. I mean, for what it's worth. I like to think about what it would be like to be more like Timothy Williamson, even though it's so weird.
Well, there are all those metaphysics papers from like the 1950s talking about queer metaphysical entities.
Yeah.
They're just really weird to read in the modern.
Mackey too, remember?
Yeah, Mackey. Yeah.
I prefer the queer entities. That's why I've been thinking about normativity. And yet, this is how I was able to do it, right? So I was thinking about normativity all the while in the back of my mind thinking, there's no way to naturalize this. This is ridiculous. Okay. But then ultimately I think, oh, well, maybe something that grounds it in intuitions. Sorry, what am I saying? Intentions, second order intentions will do it. So it's like, the project is the same for everybody, but do you go with intuitions and then clean it up, or do you keep it clean as you can move forward? Sorry, I don't want to repeat myself. Okay, so what else? What else do we have here?
I think this is where the identity theory comes in for the first time.
Yeah, it's sort of like the last candidate after the Quinean stuff is the identity theory. I think. Yeah.
Take it away, Josh. It's your bag.
Well, so I mean, this is something I've been toying with, and I guess it's very Russellian in the sense that one takes propositions, or the parts of propositions, to just be identical with the entities named. And so to say of a proposition that it's true is just to say that it's, actual. I guess that the world it is that way. The problem that he entertains here, though, is that one might accept, I guess, one, truth is grounded and grounding is a relation, and this seems to lead to absurdity, which I completely agree. So in my kind of entertaining identity theory, I've rejected truth making, but apparently this Julian Dodds doesn't. And the argument here is that no, this is clearly absurd because unless this truth-making relation is self-reflexive, wait, what's the actual word? Not self-reflexive.
Irreflexive.
Irreflexive. The proposition can't be identical with itself, but also make itself true, because grounding is asymmetrical, and you would get symmetry, and everything seems to break down. So yeah, I completely grant that this is absurd. Like, they do not work together. An identity theory of truth and truth making as a grounding relation, or any kind of relation, just well, that's not true. Any kind of relation is not true. Grounding as this asymmetrical necessitation doesn't work. Completely grant that. And Dodds is his main target here. And I completely agree. I completely agree. And I don't really know what else to say. I felt kind of like abused that he kept beating on identity theory, because I'm like, but why would you accept these arguments? Like, I don't know why you would do that.
Okay, so I have two responses to that. First of all, I thought you would say that, and I agree with you. However, there's two other points here. One is a distinction between a robust identity theory and a modest one. I'm not sure I understood what comes of this, but I wanted you to comment on it. And the second issue I would ask about is, if I understand your conception of identity theory, motivated by Russell's early theory of propositions, and we recognize this, at least for now, as not at all what Dodd is trying to do, then what do you do about what do you do about false propositions?
Right. I mean, that is the problem, I think, with an identity theory. And I think that's probably why I was drawn to Armstrong, where truth, well, no, I'm going to make a separate point entirely. But this idea that there's a singular world and aspects of the world, and some metaphysical machinery makes true propositions. So like recombination, or mereological sums of aspects of the world, however you want to cash that out. The actual world determines the meaning of the parts of propositions. And then, so that's how you get meaning in a proposition. But how do you get meaning for false propositions? Well, the same way. So aspects of the world would give meaning to propositions as, meaning complexes. Then they're not being the way the world is, not being identical with the world. That is, that combination of aspects of the world is not the way the world is, would be a false proposition. In other words, it's not being identical with the world is what determines its falsity. But it's kind of like jumping frameworks, right? Because I just don't think there really is, like, being false is just not being identical with. That's what false is. And then if a true proposition is just that proposition being identical with itself, with the world. It just is that aspect of the world, or something like that. Does that make sense?
I mean,
like say you take
if a
like
proposition is false, but it is identical with some part of the world, then if that part of the world is the truth maker for the truth, because it is identical, then it would be a true proposition after all. So
But yeah, this is where I want to depart from Russell, because I think there's a problem, and I want to say that propositions are possible mental states. So the content is identical, but not necessarily the proposition. So there's more work to be done, I think, to get like false propositions and
okay, well, maybe we can
true
just wait
negative
and see what
existentials.
happens. Maybe after you read on negative propositions at Armstrong, you'll think of something. What about what about modest versus robust? What did you think of that?
Oh, didn't he cash that in a footnote?
No,
Is that in the main
that's
paper?
in the main text. The modest one is the Frege sense world, realm of sense rather, and the strong one is Dodd's.
But doesn't Dodd in his paper analyze both? I think that's what the footnote says,
I
which
didn't
is
read it.
which is which is
Oh, I
why
see.
I would want to read Dodd, is if he does do a weak and strong analysis. That would be quite interesting.
Okay, so basically we'll just talk about that when we read Dodd.
I think so, yeah. If we do read Dodd, yeah.
Okay, so then we have the conclusion. He accepts TM, therefore he accepts ST. There's no escape from truth makers as entities. And then he doesn't know what to do about negative existential truths. But something must be done.
But the argument really is you cannot deny or get away from truth makers once you've accepted this groundedness of truth. I think that's kind of the key point, right? Once you accept that truth is grounded, you cannot escape truth making.
I would make it stronger. I don't know why I didn't put it this way, but it's not just that you can't escape truth makers, but that you can't escape truth makers as entities. Does that matter? I thought it does.
Interesting.
Yeah, it does, because the truth maker principle, as he sets it out, refers to entities. So that's what he means by truth maker.
Yeah.
But the argument for that is that you can't have relations without entities. So it's really just a groundedness is a relation. So that
right.
entails entities. But he has such a loose, I mean, he's going to go on to say that resemblance. I'm not sure how he's going to cash out ways in terms of resemblance to sets or whatever groupings, however he does that, because those don't sound like entities to me. But if those are entities, it seems like anything could be a relata in this relation. Like moments, that first paper we read about moments could be it, or arbitrary slices of anything could be entities in that sense. And then I'm not sure who would really resist any of that.
Didn't you say earlier today that you were moved by Davidson to question whether truth requires a relation to particular entities? I mean, Davidson's very explicit. He says correspondence doesn't imply correspondence to anything in particular, just to reality as a whole.
Yes. And
okay, well that's argued against here in the conclusion.
Oh, no, I'm saying if you accept that truth is grounded, I don't know why you would have an issue with the entity. I'm not sure truth is grounded. I'm not sure that grounding big G is a relation in the way that's analyzed in this
Never
paper.
mind big G. What about grounded at all?
Well, again, that's going to come down to, I mean, if I understood what small g grounding that accounted for truth making was, and it was convincing, like, of course I would accept it then, but I haven't heard it yet.
What about the slogan that, truth supervenes on reality? I mean,
my concern comes down to meaning, not truth. So I want to understand what propositions are, what determines the meaning of propositions, and then I think truth will follow. So I'm not sure that.
What about? Look, I mean, what about? I mean, okay, fine. Truth will follow if you figure out meaning, and you haven't figured out meaning. Okay, fine. But what about truth and that supervenience slogan?
What about it?
Was it?
Do you deny it? Do you agree with it, or do you just not want to talk about it?
Was it Armstrong?
It presupposes meaning is correspondence. That's my problem, and I'm not sure if meaning is.
Well. Okay, this is
the meaning of a sentence is in some way reference to the world, and I'm not sure if there is this correspondence. It could be that the world causes mental representations, but that there isn't this, atomist correspondence between propositions and the way the world is. But it might be that propositions are the products of this causal relation. So the relation isn't grounding, but it's a causal relation.
Okay, never mind the causing.
Wait. Let's just.
Go ahead, Karen. Yeah.
We had someone who said meaning and truth making are separate issues, right? Like that. You shouldn't think that somehow the meaning of a sentence of a proposition is determined by the things that make it true. Because, I could say, that there are two mammals in my, well, at least two mammals in my house right now. I think the dog's in too, and there's me, so there's at least three. at least 3 mammals in my house right now, but that doesn't mean that sentence doesn't mean my dog and my cat and I, but my dog and my cat and I make it true. A lot of other things could make it true. Well, like if it's claimed that at least 2 mammals are in my house right now, then my dog and I can make it true, my cat and I make it true, but it doesn't mean my cat and I or my dog and I or so yeah, so truth making and meaning are separate. Somebody made that point. Was it Armstrong? Parsons? Can't remember.
Yeah, I mean, this is really the tension that I feel, and it caused me to push back on this idea of truth making as a grounding relation because I'm just yeah, I'm just
Right,
not
and
sure.
it's maybe it was Armstrong because one of the things doesn't. I mean, he wants to say that it's the world that we have that makes negative claims true, right? So if I say that there are no unicorns, it's the world that makes that true, but it means something other than the world in its entirety. Like that doesn't somehow give you the content of the proposition.
Right, right.
Because then every negative existential claim like that would have the same meaning, which doesn't seem, there are no Pegasus flying horses. Pegasi, I don't know. Right. Means the same thing as there are no unicorns. No, they don't mean the same thing, but they have the same truth maker, the
Yeah,
world.
that's largely my concern is that if you too tightly couple truth making and meaning, when you lack truth makers, you lack meaning.
Right,
You,
but
you begin to say, and that feels absolutely like obviously wrong to me, like
right,
100% wrong to me.
but
So it seems that meaning and truth making must come apart in order to salvage any retention of intuitions that we mean things. When we say all these weird things that don't seem to have truth makers, we do mean them. Like it's not nonsense, or that they have one truth maker that gives them content. And yet we seem to be able to individuate the meanings of these weird sentences, but not really. We're wrong about that. It's very unintuitive.
yeah,
It feels wrong to me.
I think we need to, I think we need to keep separate the issues of the meaning and the content of propositions and the truth makers. There might be some propositions where the truth maker gives it, especially with things like indexicals, maybe the truth maker gives it its meaning in some sense.
What do you mean we should keep them separate? I mean, do you mean separate in
Well,
a
as one of the theorists made it very clear that this is not a theory of truth making is not a theory of meaning.
But if truth making is a grounding relation and there has to be this minimal condition of the content of a proposition having some relation to the truth maker, isn't that conflating the two?
No, I don't think so.
No, I mean, that was that
Um,
minimal point I read earlier.
it might be. I mean, you might think it is, but if at least, I mean, he seems open to the idea that the truth maker for the rose is not blue might be the redness, the rose being red, right? But the rose is not blue does not mean the rose is red, because the rose is not blue could be true if the rose was any kind of other color besides blue. So to say the rose is not blue is not to say the rose is red, but it might be the redness of the rose that makes it true that the rose is not blue. So I think it's
Well, the
going
redness
to
of the rose
be,
could make true the proposition that the rose is red, which would entail the falsity of the proposition that the rose is blue being false, right?
which shows you that the truth maker for the rose is not blue is different from the meaning of the rose is not blue.
Okay, good. That okay, you're making my point, but I'm trying to argue for this against this paper because on page.
I think this paper does not equate truth making with meaning.
So what do you make of this on 231? A very minimal idea. It is simply the idea that the truth of a truth bearer is determined by its subject matter. or some
Yeah.
feature of it. So what does that mean then? How is that not bringing the two together?
Because subject matter, I don't think means meaning.
No?
I mean, it's an interesting choice of phrase. What year is this paper? I'm not sure, but it's, yeah, I mean, when I read that, I thought it was sort of ambiguous. I wasn't sure whether he meant meaning or reference.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I just read it as meaning, so I could be wrong about that.
I mean,
And
he doesn't,
Yeah.
I mean, you know, uh,
And in
yeah,
some way,
I'm not
I
sure.
mean, not, it's, okay, so it's determined by its subject matter, but the subject matter is, I mean, I guess it depends on, are we slipping into the identity theory, right? Because the subject matter is what the proposition is about. But that's something, that's the world, right? So is the meaning the world? I guess it depends on your account of meanings, or meanings chunks of the world, or meaning something else. So
But I mean, do you think you could analyze truth making without presupposing a theory of meaning? Or without even determining your theory of meaning by the truth making relation? I mean, I guess I'm not sure how to even tackle truth making without understanding meaning better. And to say like I'll figure out meaning afterwards, I don't feel like I can do this. It just doesn't. Everything seems to depend on meaning. The relation between substance of the proposition, or the subject matter of the proposition, and then whatever purported relation it has to that subject matter is the, that's where truth comes in.
right, but the so if
Well, part of
we're
the issue is,
like, so if we say that the Sharpie, well, Molly has something to say here. If we say that
What a pet paradox.
if we say that, yeah, if we say that the Sharpie is red, right? And so this Sharpie makes that true, then it's, and he says it's the redness, this way of the Sharpie being that makes it true. And then says the Sharpie is not blue. And then it turns out that it's the same redness of the Sharpie that makes that true. Those two sentences have the same subject matter, but different meanings. Because they're both about the redness of the Sharpie, but to say that the Sharpie is not blue is to say something different than the Sharpie is red, because they're informative in different ways. Like one is like maybe a subset of the meaning of the other or something. Right, maybe to say the Sharpie is red is to mean in part that the Sharpie is blue, but to say the Sharpie is blue is not to mean that the Sharpie is red. Is not, sorry, to say that the Sharpie is red is to in part say that it is not blue. But to say that it's not blue is not to say that it is red.
How can
Right,
it be
so
in part
they
to
mean
say?
different
It,
things.
it certainly follows from it, but it's not in part to say.
Well, I'm trying to say which way they could be say to have the same meaning. And I think maybe you could say that when you say that it's part of saying something is red, is part of that meaning is to say it's not blue. But when you say something's not blue, it's not part of the meaning of that to say that it's red. It's adding more information, is adding something. So yeah, so the subject matter might be the same if the truth maker for both is this red part.
Yeah.
Right. But the subject matter and the so in that sense, the subject matter might be the same, but they're saying different things. There's a difference in the meaning.
Can I just
I think a theory of meaning would be very helpful, but I think that, yeah, I don't think that this paper equates the two. You're right that subject matter quote is perhaps ambiguous and definitely needs unpacking.
That brought to mind to me what I've read about aboutness from Yablo, for example, which
Right. I was just about to bring that
yeah,
up.
which takes a proposition and tries to identify what it is about, right? And which is naively, at least, well, naively the referent of one of the singular terms in the proposition, but independently of the difficulty of picking which is the relevant singular term, it excludes the predicates or any properties the predicates might correspond to. So subject matter is a way of saying if there is a correspondence relation uh, from the proposition to reality, a certain portion of whatever it is corresponding to is the subject matter. And that has relevance for anaphoric reference. Not to make this about linguistics, but um, I don't know what else it would matter to be honest. I have no idea why aboutness even is an interesting topic for philosophy of language, but I do know that they've been talking about it. So I took that away. I took that
Well,
away
I
for
think
him to
he
say,
relates it to relevance somehow, I think.
yeah, well, sure, but my question was stand about relevance. I'm not sure how. So I took it just to be a way of saying correspondence might be about the entities and also the features. And so the subject matter would be the entities and the features would be something else. But then if you take the features to be entities, then all the relevant entities that make up the correspondence that constitute the truth maker would be the subject matter, at least for the purposes of a truth maker theory. Have we had enough?
No.
You need more? I'm not with you at all on separating truth from meaning. I have always loved the identification of meaning with both reference and truth conditions. And I don't see why you want to give up on that. Or are you not really giving up on that and I've misunderstood you?
Oh,
So
me?
who me?
No,
Yeah.
Josh.
Joshua.
So I mean, I have a very actually it's incredibly simple account of truth, and I'm just trying to make sense of it in terms of these existing philosophical positions. Um, it's causal. It's causal, and my account of error is that because the content of concepts are caused by the world, they have a content in virtue of their history, that the possibility of error comes with the application. So, I mean, I think a lot of cognitive acts are inferential. And so when the tokening of a concept is caused by the world, there's it's true. It's true because the world is what caused it. It already existed, and then it is the world that tokened the concept. And when it's the world that tokens, then its application within a a mental state, the totality of a mental state, like as proposition, and the world is what caused it. It's true. Now, when we apply concepts by way of inductive inference, it may or may not be the way that the world is. And this is where all the difficulties come in. And so in the cases where the world is not that way and we apply it, then the propositions are clearly false. And then where we get the really interesting Gettier cases, it's when we do apply the correct concepts, but not in the right way, right? They're not tokened by the world, and we applied them for the wrong reasons, but they're still true, right? And this is where we
Okay,
get into
Josh,
this.
didn't you start this whole essay of yours with, I have a very simple theory of truth?
Well, it
That's
is.
that simple.
It's that the world determines meaning. So in the best cases, meaning and truth come together. That's right. But that in the bad cases, when the sentences are false or the propositions are false, the meaning is still caused by the world, but isn't tokened by the world in that instance.
Okay.
And then in the hard cases, the Gettier cases, it's when the content is caused by the world, but the tokenings are not caused by the world, but the world actually would token those concepts if the person was, epistemically appropriately situated or whatever.
Okay,
But they weren't.
but truth conditions are playing a role in mental representation
Yes.
attitudes
Look,
other than assertion, other than knowledge. For instance, I might be lying to you, right? So I might say, hey, there's a lot of money in that deal,
Yeah.
right? What causes me to say that is the utility of succoring you or conning you.
Yeah.
Um, How is that accounted? I mean, where's the connection between that and, or how about just a question? Like I might ask you, where did you park the car? Right? Did where my car was parked cause me to ask that question? Certainly not. And yet the truth conditions of it give it its meaning. So I'm just not, I'm lost in, your account begins to make sense, although not completely, but that's my fault for an account of knowledge. But truth conditions are applicable elsewhere.
Truth conditions and truth making are, I think, different. I think you could have an account of meaning that has to do with truth conditions, but still say that if a particular proposition is true, the truth maker is not the meaning of that proposition. Doesn't have to be. So, for example, to understand this Sharpie is not blue might be to understand the truth conditions that make it appropriate to say this Sharpie is not blue, but it's going to include this kind of condition, this kind of condition. I'm out of Sharpies. Assume this was a Sharpie, this kind of condition, but not this kind of condition, right?
Right, but all you have to say is,
but if this is the truth maker for this Sharpie is not blue, what about all those other conditions?
but depending on how you want to analyze the truth conditions, could just be the
it's
set
one
of
of the
truth
set.
makers. That's right.
But
yeah.
that's so. But so it's not the truth conditions.
No,
I mean,
I take truth conditions to be grounded in truth makers. The truth conditions are just,
They can do that. They can be grounded in truth makers and possible truth makers.
that's what I
But
meant.
that's not to say that they are grounded in the truth maker.
The truth conditions aren't grounded in the truth maker.
So okay. So if there's a
No, actually, can I answer that? So I think
because there could be, because truth makers can be multiple. I mean, yeah. So if I say
that,
that,
just introducing modality, though, right? Because the truth conditions.
Yeah, but I'm not going to try to do this without modality. I mean, forget it.
Right. But I mean, that's to say that the meaning of a proposition are the truth conditions, which are the possible truth makers for that sentence, right?
Yeah. The truth maker for a true proposition is some entity, and the meaning of that proposition are the possible truth makers. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, exactly.
But possible truth makers don't cause anything unless they're also actual.
No, actual truth makers within the set of truth makers, or the set of possible truth makers, gives content to an actual mental state.
But that determines simple at all. That sounds like the complex one everybody's trying to figure out.
Well, that determines the content of the concept, but that doesn't determine the truthfulness of its application.
I'm lost.
Well, the point is really just, my difficulty is in the relationship between meaning and truth, and that I'm not sure what's being said here. It does seem that there's an ambiguity that's very important, that is a lot's hinging on. That's enough to emphasize that. That's what is concerning me.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so next, I want to read Hornsby, and I want to read Dodd, but only if Josh.
Is this in the other book, or what?
Yeah, the Hornsby is in the other book.
Okay.
And then Dodd, unless Josh skims it, doesn't like it, and then the Lewis one, and then if we want more, the postscript to this one, and then that's it. That's all I want.
Would anybody interested in taking a break and maybe reading that paper on the third man argument? I wouldn't mind.
No.
Well, aren't we gonna read that on Tuesday? I don't know.
No, we're not. Nothing is scheduled for Tuesday. The problem with third man is that it's actually 5 papers, not 1. So that's actually a series. That's not an interlude. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Let me tell you about it. Actually, it's the Vlastos, and then two replies to the Vlastos, one by Geach and one by Sellers.
Sellers, yeah.
And then responses by Vlastos to both of those.
Cool.
Yeah. So okay. So anyway, that's the plan.
Cool.
All right, I'll stop here.
All right.